Debates aimed at identifying why global folk tales often appeared to have similar storylines. Andrew Lang argued for some polygenesis of tales, proposing that similar plots appeared in multiple locations due to the similarity of human mindsets and paths of cultural development. Jacobs, in his 1891 Folklore Congress paper, conversely proposed the theory of monogenesis, that folk tales were created by a single genius and diffused with population migrations, adapting during multiple retellings. 282 The FLS's project to tabulate folk tale types from around the world according to plot incidents, in hope of understanding their possible origins and distribution patterns, was highly ambitious. Marion Cox's Cinderella, 345 variants 1893, with a defensive introduction from Lang, provided the first and only volume of this project. 283 In subsequent folklore issues, the diffusion of Cinderella was lengthily debated, resulting in very few concrete conclusions. The folk tale project was subsequently abandoned, representing another example of a grand project that ultimately fell short of its original goal. During this era, many major works of comparative folk tale traced similar plotlines across different versions of tales, often with the aim of reconstructing primitive beliefs. Clouston's Popular Tales and Fictions 1887 modeled his comparative methodology, often finding similarities between European and Indian tales. 284 Heartland's Science of Fairy Tales 1891 also compared various myths tracing themes such as fairies, human midwives, supernatural time-lapse in fairyland, and swan maidens in hope of identifying underlying ancient beliefs. 285 Claude and Tom Tit-Tot 1898 examined the theme of taboo in knowing a fairy creature's name from the Rumpelstiltskin tale type. 286 He proposed that primitive concepts of magical power held in names, hair, and saliva underpinned the tale. Ultimately, as it became evident that no solution to folk tale origins was forthcoming, discussions became less polarized and heated debates died down. The final section of Chapter 2 discusses how Lang, Jacobs, and also Heartland helped embed folk tales within the nursery by producing popular children's folk tale collections. Lang believed folk tales represented facets of primitive culture from the childhood of humankind. It was naturally assumed that the fantastical elements in these stories would also appeal to children who stood at the bottom of an analogous line of cultural development as they grew up. 287 With the popularity of such picture books, these volumes helped situate folk tales and their magical characters in the nursery. This of course helped to reinforce the cultural position of the nursery fairy. 282 Jacobs, The Science of Folk Tales and Problem of Diffusion, in A. Nutt and J. Jacobs, eds. International Folklore Congress. 1891. Papers and Transactions, London, 1892 pp. 76-98. 283 M. R. Cox, Cinderella 345 variants, London, 1893. 284 W. A. Clouston, Popular Tales and Fictions, 2 vols. London, 1887. 285 Heartland, Science of Fairy Tales. 286 Claude, Tom Tit-Tot. 287 R. Van Brunswyk, Enchanted, The Fairy Tale as Meeting Place in the Late Victorian Period, unpublished Ph.D. thesis. University of Birmingham, 2001 p. 65, see also, K. Hensley, Network, Andrew Lang and the Distributed Agencies of Literary Production, Victorian Periodicals Review 48, 2015, 374, E. Tucker, Changing Concepts of Childhood, Children's Folklore Scholarship Since the Late 19th Century, The Journal of American Folklore 125 2012 392, Newton, ed. Victorian Fairy Tales, XV. 31. Chapter 3 traces the declining popularity of the euhemerist theory that fairies represented historical folk memories of Britain's ancient inhabitants, driven into isolated regions by waves of invaders. Gomes Ethnology and Folklore 1892 argued that fairycraft formed from conquerors' perceptions of the supposed demonical powers of Aboriginal races. Witchcraft, conversely, descended from the Aboriginal race's own beliefs. 288 David McCritchie worked historical race theory into a full system in Testimony of Tradition 1890 by linking various historical and legendary groups based on passing similarities or loose etymology. He made an ethnological case for a short mound-dwelling historical fairy race that spanned the globe. McCritchie's work garnered some support, but tenuous links between his sources and also the monocausal nature of his theory were critiqued. Murray, the controversial witchcraft historian, brought a strand of historical race theory into the 20th century in The Witch Cult in Western Europe, 1921. 289. She argued that early modern European witch trials represented the legacy of a Paleolithic fertility cult, who worshipped a horned god. Fairies fit into Murray's thesis as an aboriginal race driven into marginal areas, yet clinging onto, and initiating others into, their ancient religion. Surprisingly, this rationalizing Victorian theory became incorporated into neo-paganism. Gerald Gardner, FLS member and founding father of Wicca, included Murray's theory in Witchcraft Today, 1954. 290. By the early 20th century, whilst this theory was popular with the public, it had been marginalized by folklorists. Chapter 4 reassesses Dorson's correlation between the rising Celtic dawn and the end of English folklore studies. 291. It explores the interplay between the FLS's treatment of Celtic fairies and their complicated connection to Celtic nationalism. Riz's Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx, 1901, discusses Welsh fairy mythology, particularly lake maidens. It builds a unique cultural backdrop for Welsh fairies centered around landscape, language, and ethnology. 292. Rhys, as an Oxford scholar, packaged his Welsh fairies in a standard folkloric format familiar to English FLS members. Similarly, Jonathan Ceredig Davies's Folklore of West and Mid Wales 1911 displays a culturally unique model for Welsh folklore. 293. Yet Davies, who walked around Wales collecting oral tales, demonstrates the work of a more independent and marginal FLS member. Consideration of Irish fairies proved to be more politicized. With the rising Celtic dawn, and Yeats's writings, fairies joined the Irish cultural revival, forming an important strand. 288. G. L. Gom, Ethnology and Folklore, London, 1892. 289. M. A. Murray, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, A Study in Anthropology, Oxford, 1921. 290. G. B. Gardner, The Meaning of Witchcraft, Tame, 2000. G. B. Gardner, Witchcraft Today, London, 1966. 291. Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 439. 292. J. Rhys, Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx, 2 vols. Oxford, 1901. 293. Jonathan Ceredig Davies, Folklore of West and Mid Wales, 1911. Of this new cultural nationalism. 294. Yates and Evans Wentz portrayed a contemporary Celtic fairy which had an active cultural and spiritual role, very different from FLS members' survivalist models. Yet Irish connections within the London-based FLS had always remained marginal. Nutt's Voyage of Bran, 1895-1897, discusses the threads of the happy other world and doctrine of rebirth running through Irish mythology. 295. He argued that Irish peasants' fairy beliefs represented the fragmented legacy of an ancient Aryan religious system. Englishman Nutt was no Irish nationalist, but rather an admirer of Celtic mythology. His presidential speech, The Fairy Mythology of English Literature, 1897, traced the Celtic strand of fairy lore into Shakespeare's writings, rather imperialistically claiming it for a united Britain. 296. In the 1910s, Westrop's multiple folklore surveys of County Clare and Connacht demonstrated the important rise in local Irish fieldwork. His death in 1922 represents a key break between the FLS and Irish folklorists amid souring Anglo-Irish relations. After Irish independence, the professionalized and state-sponsored Irish Folklore Commission was set up in 1935, signaling a concrete national break from more amateur English folkloristics. 297. Chapter 5 traces the FLS's declining cultural influence in the early 20th century, coupled with its waning academic interest in the fairy. The Victorian founding members with ambitious plans had slowly passed away, along with their experience and knowledge. During this era, the FLS also faced organizational and economic difficulties with wartime disruption, decreasing publishing power after publisher Nutt's death in 1910, and rising paper prices. As their research and publishing ability diminished, so did their voice. The strong internal debates and ambitious plans that hallmarked the late Victorian era had ended. An attempt to publish a series on the calendar customs of Britain took 30 years to come to fruition. A shift in folkloristics' theoretical landscape also occurred. In 1918, Robert Ranulph Merritt challenged the FLS's prevailing theoretical model in his presidential speech, The Transvaluation of Culture. He proposed a template for folklore which included modern phenomena and revivals. 298 As anthropology gained a foothold in universities, the FLS mainly clung onto its survivalist notions, continuing as a dilettante hobbyist venture. As the FLS's influence declined, so did the position of the fairies within it. Fairies had increasingly become associated with children's picture books during the Edwardian era, becoming cute and diminutive. When Doyle released the Cottingley fairy photographs in 1920 to international controversy, FLS members virtually ignored the 294 W. B. Yeats, The Celtic Twilight, London, 1902. See also E. Hirsch, Coming Out into the Light, W. B. Yeats's The Celtic Twilight, Journal of the Folklore Institute 18, 1981, 1-22, F. Casey, A Celtic Twilight in Little England, G. K. Chesterton and W. B. Yeats, Irish Studies Review 22, 2014, 80-91. 295a. Nutt and K. Meyer, The Voyage of Bran Son of Feeble, 2 vols. London, 1895-1897. 296a. Nutt, Presidential Address, The Fairy Mythology of English Literature, Its Origin and Nature, Folklore 8, 1897, 29-53. 297 Lysott, Collecting Folklore Ireland 1927-70, 1-30. 298 R. Merritt, Presidential Address, The Transvaluation of Culture, Folklore 29, 1918, 15-33. 33. Furore. 299 These new fairies were not the fairies of serious folklore studies. The images looked aesthetically dubious and they represented childhood fairies. 300 Doyle's claims connected fairies to contemporary spiritualist manifestations which did not fit the FLS's rational model of fairies as ossified historical beliefs. FLS members were cautious about discussing psychical phenomena for fear it would damage the academic reputation of folklore. Between the wars, only a few folklore articles discuss fairies, taking their lead from Victorian scholarship. 299 Doyle, Coming of the Fairies, A. C. Doyle, The Cottingley Fairies, an Epilogue, The Strand Magazine, Feb. 1923, 105. 300, Doyle Fairies Toy Shop Flappers, Critics Insists, New York Tribune, 28 April. 1922, 1. Chapter 1. Collecting and Compiling Fairies. The English countryside was considered a site of ancient myths, its peasants a storehouse of archaic superstitions. Their ways, isolated from modernity, seemingly remained unchanged for generations, perhaps even before recorded history. Some peasants' lore in civilized Victorian England was considered to hail from a cultural stage directly parallel to primitive natives in the far reaches of the empire. 301 FLS members went out into the countryside or scoured their local libraries gathering fragments of folklore before steam trains and education reached the most isolated rural corners, expelling the last remnants of ancient fairy lore in their wake. It was this conception that underpinned the FLS's collection efforts. Bennett discusses the significant perception of an England, bathed in mellow hues, inhabited by contented yokels with picturesque customs in a landscape of fields and woods and quiet farms. 302 This English myth arose in reaction to starker 19th-century urban environments. 303 She later noted that folklorists accepted the myth of rural England and orientated themselves within that worldview, their work being soaked in rural imagery and nostalgia for the past. 304 Rural nostalgia mixed with anthropological concepts of survivalism provided a potent mix, turning the countryside into a vast storehouse of precious cultural information, a museum of the human race. 305 Bennett notes it is perhaps an exaggeration to say that cultural evolution was the English myth made into a theory of culture, but it is not much of an exaggeration. 306 And so the fairies haunted this landscape, in the minds of the superstitious peasants, waiting to attack their cattle or steal their children, just like the various spirits believed in by more primitive overseas cultures. Prior to the FLS, collection of folklore material started with the antiquaries. Influenced by the sway of Romantic nationalism, they recorded features of the countryside environment, traditions, and tales of rural populations. 307 Dorson's British folklorists extensively covers antiquaries including John Aubrey, John Brand, Thomas Crofton Croker, Thomas Cately, Walter Scott, and Robert Chambers. Dorson argues the great team built British folklore scholarship upon the work of these founders. 308 Unsurprising the FLS's first annual report. 301a. Lang, Custom and Myth, London, 1893 p. 22. See also Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 111. 302 Bennett, English Folklore, 27. See also. G. Bennett, Folklore Studies in the English Rural Myth, Rural History 4, 1993, 89. 303 Bennett, English Folklore, 27. 304 Bennett, English Folklore, 32. 305 Bennett, English Folklore, 34. 306 Bennett, English Folklore, 33. 307 R. D. Abrahams, Phantoms of Romantic Nationalism in Folkloristics, The Journal of American Folklore 106 1993, 3. 308 Dorson, British Folklorists, pp. 1-160. 35. Declared that collecting was the main work of the Society, 309 and repeated calls stressing the importance of fieldwork. Many items were printed in the Collectanea section of Folklore after Gaume argued the need for a section, exclusively devoted to collection, for members to print, stray bits of folklore. 310 Throughout the era, there was an increasing methodological awareness and guides, such as the Handbook of Folklore 1890, were centralized texts encouraging a standardized practice of collecting folklore. However, a division of labor is apparent between those who collected items, usually the less conspicuous provincial members and many women, and the higher status metropolitan members who engaged primarily with anthropological theory. Gaume saw the collection process as twofold, incorporating both fieldwork amongst the people 311 and library work finding folklore scraps scattered in various publications and manuscripts. 312 This chapter explores the various efforts of FLS members to conduct fieldwork, going out into the countryside and interviewing the folk. It also considers the immense bibliographic drive to collect, copy, categorize, and print scraps of tradition scattered in regional newspapers and innumerable books. The FLS aimed to build a body of facts from which folklore theorists could draw. Dedicated FLS collectors spanned Britain and Ireland from Skye 313 to the Channel Islands. 314 In this connection, we examine the structural reasons why the County Folklore series was discontinued in 1914, after just 7 volumes, despite initial enthusiasm. Fairy lore was also recorded from members around the Empire and by those exploring overseas regions. We explore the work of Indian collector William Crook, specialist in the Naga people John Henry Hutton, and Beatrice Blackwood's collections in New Guinea. As there was an increasing concern to record other cultures and local terminology, the fairy, as an essentially Western-centric concept, joined the pantheon of supernatural entities all over the globe. This is especially evident in Burns' edition of Handbook of Folklore 1914, where the earlier category of goblindom became merged into the category of international gods and godlings. This movement ultimately resulted in the fairy becoming a less important category of comparative assessment by the 1920s. Collection efforts started with strong centralized ambition, but ultimately resulted in patchy coverage. Dorson recognized the haphazard and random character of English collecting. 315 He lamented that he bright promise of folklore collecting in England was never fulfilled. 316 This chapter traces the ambitious late Victorian. 309 Folklore Society, First Annual Report, 4. 310 G. L. Gaume, Annual Address to the Folklore Society, Folklore 2, 1891, 28. 311 Gaume, Annual Address 1891, 26. 312 Gaume, Annual Address 1891, 26. 313 J. A. McCullough, The Misty Isle of Skye, Its Scenery, Its People, Its Story, Edinburgh, 1905. 314 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 319. 315 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 320. 316 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 331. Plan to gather folklore, and fairy lore, from around Britain and the globe in the FLS's publications. However, this plan had not come to fruition by the 1920s, as the FLS faced publication difficulties and methodological pressures from the increasingly important anthropological fieldworkers. It is also worth acknowledging, as Ashton does, that many regional folklorists collected and wrote volumes developing approaches independently from the FLS's intellectual dogma. 317 Although outside of the scope of this thesis, they also form a key aspect of British folkloristics worthy of more scholarly consideration. 318. 1.1 Patterns of collection. Following the Taylorian anthropological model, many FLS members considered folklore as fragments of savage or primitive culture that were gradually dying out. Engaging with cultural Darwinistic ideas of extinction, folklore was a dying fossilized layer of culture, not an active process of cultural change. Nicolaisen notes that, a gleaner's vision, dominated fieldwork from the moment of Thoms's conception. 319 The concept of dying folklore, also upheld by Taylorian ideas of survivalism, created a notion of urgency, of timely intervention, of a last-minute rescue operation put into action by the rallying cry. 320 Calls to set about collecting the last remnants of English folklore. 321 were regularly repeated in the FLS journal. In 1897 the council called upon members to promote interest in folklore and the society, more widely, due to the fast perishing mass of British traditions. 322 As modern urbanization and technology encroached upon rural ways, so the need for collection seemingly became more urgent. 323 Heartland in English Fairy and Other Folk Tales 1890 noted that such stories, formerly no doubt rife in this country, were now fast disappearing under the stress of modern life. 324 Roger Abrahams notes that the saved from the fire context was the folklorists' stock in trade. 325 Against this theoretical backdrop, focus on gathering the last lingering remnants of folklore was a dominating characteristic of FLS collection methodologies during the late Victorian period. In 1878 Charlotte Latham in Some West Sussex Superstitions Lingering notes that a belief of fairies and of fairyland is still lingering amongst youths. 326 Charles Godfrey Leland contributed Etrusco-Roman remains in modern Tuscan tradition to the 1891 Folklore Congress, noting that he had recorded in northern Italy a tolerably complete cult or system, whilst in all other. 317 Ashton, Beyond Survivalism, 19. 318 See also, Ashton, Beyond Survivalism, 19-23. 319 Nicolaisen, A Gleaner's Vision, 74. 320 Nicolaisen, A Gleaner's Vision, 74. 321 Folklore Society, 3rd Annual Report of the Council, The Folklore Record for 1881 206. 322 Folklore Society, 19th Annual Report of the Council, Folklore 8, 1897 22. 323 J. M. Harris, Folklore and the Fantastic, p. 9. 324 E. S. Hartland, ed. English Fairy and Other Folk Tales London, 1906 b. This is referenced from the later edition. 325 Abrahams, Phantoms of Romantic Nationalism, 11. 326 C. Latham, Some West Sussex Superstitions Lingering in 1868, The Folklore Record 1, 1878 26. 37. European countries, superstitions are now only scattered fragments. 327 His article investigates several spirits associated with fairies, 328 such as the goddess of the four winds, 329 and the house-haunting goblin, the red cap or il folletto colla beretta rosa. 330 These are framed as remnants of ancient beliefs rather than contemporary Tuscan beliefs. Charlotte Burns Shropshire Folklore, A Sheaf of Gleanings 1883-331 and Leland Duncan's 1893 article, Folklore Gleanings from County Leitrim, 332 even evoke Thoms's agricultural metaphor of gleaning the lingering remains of folklore. Throughout the FLS's journal pages, similar theoretical contentions are frequently repeated. FLS collectors during this period consistently looked to the most isolated, unspoiled, peripheral rural areas, as the most likely places to be harboring folklore. Jason Harris notes this evoked aspects of rural sentimentalism, or perhaps even romanticism, as a distinctive alternative voice to the emerging modernism of industrial progress and urbanization. 333 Hutton describes an almost hysterical celebration and veneration of the countryside, from the 1870s as a reaction against industrialization. 334 Fairy beliefs acted to further enchant the idealized rural landscape. 335 Rural areas became sites of ancient magical beliefs, the peasant inhabitants becoming mediators for this supposed ancient, virtually animistic worldview. For example, F. S. Potter in Gloucestershire Legends discusses the Mickleton Hooter, a kind of goblin who haunted Mickleton Hollow, a deep, wooded glen which runs up into the Ilmington Hills. 336 His maternal grandmother heard the howling of this creature. 337 Likewise, the account of the Fairies of Ilkley Wells relates how, one beautiful quiet midsummer morning, while ascending the brow of the hill, William Butterfield, noticed rather particularly how the birds sang so sweetly, and cheerily, and vociferously, making the valley echo with the music of their voices. 338 He considered this sign attributable to the fairies at the well. 339 The narrator's rural romanticism is palpable. Gregor in Notes on the Folklore of the Northeast of Scotland remarks that fairies were believed to dwell inside green sunny hillocks and knolls, beside a river, a stream, or a lake, or by the sea braes, in gorgeous palaces furnished with everything that was bright and 327 C. G. Leland, Etrusco-Roman remains in modern Tuscan tradition, in A. Nutt and J. Jacobs, eds. International Folklore. Congress 1891. Papers and Transactions London, 1892 p. 186. 328 Leland, Etrusco-Roman Remains, p. 186. 329 Leland, Etrusco-Roman Remains, pp. 192 to 193. 330 Leland, Etrusco-Roman Remains, p. 193. 331 C. S. Byrne, Shropshire Folklore A Sheaf of Gleaning, Volume 1, London, 1883 p. 47. 332 L. L. Duncan, Folklore Gleanings from County Leitrim, Folklore 4, 1893, 176 to 194. 333 J. M. Harris, Folklore and the Fantastic, p. 15. See also, Abraham's, Phantoms of Romantic Nationalism, 3 to 4. 334 R. Hutton, Modern Pagan Witchcraft, in W. de Blacourt, R. Hutton and J. La Fontaine, eds. Witchcraft and Magic in Europe. The 20th Century, London, 1999 p. 28. 335 See also, Bone, Fairies in 19th Century, pp. 39 to 98. 336 F. S. Potter, Gloucestershire Legends, Folklore 25 1914, 375. 337 Potter, Gloucestershire Legends, 375. 338 C. C. Smith, Fairies at Ilkley Wells, The Folklore Record 1, 1878 229. 339 C. C. Smith, Fairies at Ilkley Wells, 229. Beautiful. 340 Fairies became an animistic force projected by peasants onto an idyllic rural landscape unspoiled by modern industrialization, which could be recorded through folklore collection. Nevertheless, a slow, perceptible epistemological challenge to survivalism occurred in the 20th century. Maret's presidential speech, The Transvaluation of Culture, 1918, presented a model of folklore that included revivals and the creation of new folklore, challenging the conception that folklore was just fossilized and dying out. 341 Similarly, in 1919, William Crook complained that the fossil hunter ignored traditions, live element, and thus confused the psychologically crude with the historically ancient, the typologically with the chronologically primitive. 342 Despite theoretical changes occurring in anthropology, Bennett argues that the rural bias in folklore prevailed. 343 The countryside continued to be the primary site of British folklore collection into the 1940s. Bennett argues the rural focus prevailed due to the conservativeness of folklore, the resilience of cultural evolution, and dominance of the English rural mythos. 344 She notes that this rural bias obstinately continued over the years. 345 Even in 1922, Mary McCullough describes how the old ways and the old idiots prevailed on the Isle of Skye, despite the island being devastated by motors, English shooting tenants, and unintelligent tourists. 346 Her material, collected prior to World War I, presents a highly agricultural community. In one tale the fairies help an old woman with spinning and planting her potatoes 347 and in another they assist an old man cut his corn. 348 G. Arbor Stevens in 1939 found the little people of CWM Vermon haunting an ancient, almost supernaturalized, landscape. 349 In 1939 Elspeth Begg published some fairy anecdotes collected in Strathspey, Scotland, in which fairies play in ditches, dance on Downey Hill in Rothes Morayshire, and are purportedly heard blowing a foghorn in the mist. 350 These fairies are all country bumpkins. No FLS members recorded fairy lore concerning suburban shops or city offices. Fairies were, and have always been, associated with the countryside, as was Victorian folklore. Fairy lore collection mirrors, as Bennett notes, a shuddering distaste for the city, which runs like a thread right through all folkloristic writing of this, and indeed later periods. 351 Fairies are the 340 W. Gregor, Notes on the Folklore of the Northeast of Scotland, London, 1881 p. 59. 341 Merit, The Transvaluation of Culture, 15-33. 342 W. Crook, The Interpretation of Survivals, Folklore 30, 1919, 132-133. 343 Bennett, English Folklore, 34. 344 Bennett, English Rural Myth, 89. 345 Bennett, English Folklore, 34. 346 M. J. McCullough, Folklore of the Isle of Skye I, Folklore 33, 1922, 201-214, M. J. McCullough, Folklore of the Isle of Skye. 2. Folklore 33, 1922, 307-317, M. J. McCullough, Folklore of the Isle of Skye. 3. Folklore 33, 1922, 382-389, M. J. McCullough, Folklore of the Isle of Skye. IV, Folklore 34, 1923, 86-93. 347 M. J. McCullough, Folklore Skye I, 206. 348 M. J. McCullough, Folklore Skye I, 205. 349 G. A. Stevens, The Little People of C.W.M. Verman, Folklore 50, 1939, 385. 350 E. J. Begg, Folk Tales, Folklore 50, 1939, 75-81. 351 Bennett, English Folklore, 32. 39. Antithesis of the Urbanized, Modern, Machine Age. In May Kendall and Andrew Lang's That Very Mab, 1885, the exhibition of machinery strikes the Fairy Queen with more horror than any other novelty in this country. 352 It would have been a misnomer to conduct fieldwork or record fairy lore in city centers, even in the 1940s. However, not all rural accounts were sentimentalized. Folklore collection, as Roy Porter notes, could also be voyeuristic, presenting the lower orders as benighted and bizarre. 353 Balfour expected to find a region of bogs and swamps, of fever-haunted marshes, and ague-infested lowlands in Lincolnshire. 354 Yet she only found traces of the poor ague-shaken, opium-eating creatures of earlier times. 355 Despite finding contemporary beauty, she still describes a bleak and lonely tract, scarcely yet won over to civilization. 356 Amongst a few elders she found lingering tales of old pagan customs existing since the very dawn of history. 357 Here Balfour presents a desolate and deprived rural landscape. 358 Likewise, Emily and Percival Arland Usher's Waterford Folk Tales 1914 were collected in the Barony de Seas without Drum, where the populous centre was a hamlet of half a dozen low lime-washed thatched cottages which straggled down a moorland hollow. 359 Usher's description of the barren rural landscape has a Gothic quality to it. It is a landscape of purple desolation, consumption, empty stomachs, and insanity, where livelihoods are eked out of the ground. 360 From their starved life of struggle with the stubborn soil, the population took refuge in imaginings of unseen and supernatural beings. 361 For example, the Clutharaka Inn is small, wears a red cap, and carries a purse called a Sperrin na Sillinge, that the locals would attempt to take. 362 In another account a man demands of the fairy, Tabharam Sperrin na Sillinge. Or, give me the purse of the shillings. 363 This tale speaks of poverty with the desire to gain wealth from the fairies. The introduction of so much Gaelic terminology results in the fairy lore seeming extra peripheral and foreign, but also adds a sense of authenticity. Indeed, as Jeremiah Curtin pointed out, it was perceived that folklore was more likely to be preserved where the Gaelic language is. 352a. Lang and M. Kendall, That Very Mab, London, 1885 p. 115. 353b. P. Levick, R. Porter and M. Jashve Hofstra, Witchcraft and Magic in Europe, the 18th and 19th Centuries. London, 1999 p. 256. 354 Balfour, Legends of the Car's Eye, 145. 355 Balfour, Legends of the Car's Eye, 147. 356 Balfour, Legends of the Car's Eye, 148. 357 Balfour, Legends of the Cars I, 148. 358 For historical context of the Lincolnshire Cars and Marie Clothild's investigations C. M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, pp. 53-101. The contemporary spelling is, the Cars. M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 1. 359e. Usher and P. Usher, Waterford Folk Tales I, Folklore 25 1914, 109. 360 Usher, Waterford Folk Tales, I, 109. This article was co-authored with Emily Usher's teenage son and future writer, Percival Arland Usher, in the year the family moved back to Ireland from London. This perhaps accounts for the slightly pessimistic tone. See also, J. Weidenbach, Emily Usher and the Trail of the Black and Tans, Lisa 3, 2005 pp. 22-38, doi, 10.4000, Lisa.2487, last. Accessed the 22nd of June 2019. 361 Usher, Waterford Folk Tales, I, 110. 362 Usher, Waterford Folk Tales, I, 111. 363 Usher, Waterford Folk Tales, I, 112. Still living, and swept away completely where the language has perished. 364 Usher, very differently from other FLS members, presents an archaic Irish landscape that is inhospitable with fairies that are terrifying specters. It is notable that this material is presented in the imminent shadow of war and souring Anglo-Irish relations. Ireland could be presented as rural, but also scarily barbaric. Within their rural setting, less educated, poorer, servant class, and elderly informants were sought out as the most marginalized, therefore most likely custodians of folklore survivals. Jason Harris notes that the rural poor were thought to preserve more of Britain's native culture, as their exposure to institutions, urban centers, and education had prevented cultural assimilation. 365 The country folk, as Hutton notes, were for the first time considered to inherit a cumulative hidden knowledge from their static and immemorial culture that could act as a comforting force of resistance to the dramatic and unsettling changes of the century. 366 Abrahams notes country people's strange social placement meant their lives served as a palimpsest through which the past still might be dimly observed, perhaps even recovered. 367 A selection of informants chosen by FLS collectors exemplify this conception of the folk. In 1894 Brian Jones collected information regarding the fairies from a domestic servant, Ellen McKeever, who was a farmer's daughter with a mother from County Leitrim. 368 Minnie Cartwright's childhood gardener, the Highlander Hugh Gillies, told her many stories of fairies and kelpies. 369 Mary McCulloch's informant Donald Murchison worked as a gardener and postman, with very basic living conditions including a peat fire in the middle of the house. 370 Sophia Morrison recorded the Manx folk tale of Buggin Ny Hushti, from an old Manx weaver. 371 The elderly, with long memories, were particularly promising informants. Gom's Handbook recommended making the acquaintance of some old grandfather or grandmother of this class who loves to pour out tales of the old times. 372 Rees recorded a Lake Maiden tale from an 83-year-old man who was a very fine specimen of the better class of Welsh farmer. 373 W. Clark, aged 77, told Gregor a tale of fairies assisting a man with his threshing. 374 million rupees Brown, who related the tale of the ploughman and the fairies to her granddaughter Mrs. Goodall, died at the age of 102. 375 informants, when their age is mentioned, tended to be considerably old. 2. 364 J. Curtin, Myths and Folklore of Ireland, London, 1890 p. 11. 365 J. M. Harris, Folklore and the Fantastic, p. 14. 366 R. Hutton, Modern Pagan Witchcraft, p. 28. 367 Abrahams, Phantoms of Romantic Nationalism, 10. 368 B. J. Jones, Stories from Leitrim and Cavan, Folklore 15, 1904, 336. 369 A. MacDonald, M. Cartwright, H. M. B. Reed and D. Rory, Scraps of Scottish Folklore, Folklore 21, 1910, 90. 370 M. J. McCullough, Folklore Sky I, 202. 371 S. Morrison, Buggin Ny Hushti, The Buggin of the Water, A Manx Folktale, Folklore 34, 1923, 349. 372 Gom, ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 171. 373 Rees, Celtic Folklore, Volume 1, p. 27. 374 Gregor, Fairies from Scotland 2, 56. 375 p. H. Emerson, The Ploughman and the Fairies, Folklore 7, 1896, 303. 41. Underline the authenticity of their material. Collectors were keen to reinforce the characteristics of age, low social class, and morality when describing informants. The act of collecting was filled with potential class conflict and social uncertainties. An inherent class division stood between educated collectors and their lower class informants. Informants were generally accessed either directly via fieldwork or via local intermediaries relating folklore. The Handbook, 1890, recommended that lawyers, doctors, and especially landagents and gentlemen farmers, who were brought into contact with the uneducated locals, were particularly useful informants. 376 Byrne recommended asking amongst the class of small employers who were friendly with the folk but cultured enough to act as intermediaries, noting that the lower classes cannot well be collected direct from, as they had no conception of superstition. 377 Freeman notes the language in the 1890 handbook was pejorative, juxtaposing civilized and savage, which affected methodological endorsements. 378 However, he argues that the rural social investigator's role changed during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Rather than using intermediaries, the later model sought to gain information directly from the folk. Influenced by rural depopulation and perceptions that the urban poor were degenerate, the peasant was viewed as a preserver of noble traditions instead of being merely primitive. 379 Material in the FLS's journal shows that a mixture of direct and indirect collection methods were employed throughout our era. The story of Davith William Davith and the Fairies was related by a John Williams to Mr. Howell Walters, who then passed it on to Gom and Hartland. 380 William Butterfield's fairy experience at Ilkley Wells in 1815 was related to Charles Smith by John Dobson, Butterfield's former friend. 381 Other collectors, such as Jonathan Seredig Davies, recorded folklore directly from local inhabitants who they encountered on their travels. 382 Joseph Meehan sat in a nice dry sod ditch with his aged elf doctor informant. 383 James Fraser contributed some Highland superstitions from his family's former servant Isabella Ross, who would have been an easily accessible and approachable informant. 384 Folklore collecting by its nature was almost always a cross-class interaction. Collection efforts generally involved elite-educated FLS members recording, representing, and reinterpreting the words of marginal rural working-class people. 376 Gom, ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 169. 377 c. S. Byrne, The Collection of English Folklore, Folklore 1, 1890, 329. 378 M. Freeman, Folklore Collection and Social Investigation in Late 19th and Early 20th Century England, Folklore. 116, 2005, 56. 379 Freeman, Folklore Collection and Social Investigation, 55. 380 Hartland, Davith and the Fairies, 191. 381 C. C. Smith, Fairies at Ilkley Wells, 229. See also S. Young, Three Notes on West Yorkshire Fairies in the 19th Century, Folklore 123, 2012, 223-230. 382 Davies, West and Mid Wales, v. 383 Meehan, Cure of Elf Shooting Ireland, 204. 384 J. G. Fraser, Highland Superstitions in Inverness Shire, Folklore 1, 1890, 276. Delicate navigation was required to counteract tensions regarding class, reliability, social status, and ownership of authorial voice. There was, for example, a perception that the folk were often reluctant to relate folklore. Sheila MacDonald noted that the Highlanders were very chary of telling about their superstitions to strangers. 385 Edward Lovett noted that information was often withheld by either the ardent believer who will not expose sacred things to an outsider, or the unbeliever, who considered folklore degrading superstitions. 386 Hartland noted that peasants would not talk freely with one whom he regards as separated from him by education or position, due to fear of being laughed at. 387 Byrne notes that when frightened all, uneducated people will instinctively tell lies, feign ignorance and deny what they really know. 388 Fairies, as a category of superstition, were considered more likely to elicit problematic interactions. Fairies, as Jung recognizes, were considered a sign of ignorance, a stigma even, and that peasants may have had difficulty sharing such experiences with people of learning, for fear of mockery. 389 Indeed, this is why Maureen James notes Balfour's Legends of the Lincolnshire Cars are so unique, because they contain beliefs in the supernatural, which are not easily shared with others. 390 To overcome these issues, methodological tactics needed to be artfully employed during interactions. Freeman notes, cultural distance needed to be overcome through patient and sympathetic strategies of inquiry. 391 The FLS pooled guidance from experienced collectors in an attempt to record information as accurately as possible. Burns Handbook 1914, which will be discussed later, provided valuable guidance for improving collection techniques. 392. Fantastical elements in fairy lore led to increased tensions regarding informants' true meaning. Belief in fairies or fairy sightings were regarded as inherently ludicrous by rationalist folklorists. Similarly, Bennett notes that ghost stories were not expected to make sense, they were curiosities rather than realities. 393 For example, Sheila MacDonald recorded that the wee folk were described as a lot of lassies with preen petticoats by a man who pretended to have seen them. 394 Likewise, Cyril Patton recorded an anecdote from some men who assumed some abandoned fishing equipment was fairy fishermen's property, because it darted off at great speed. 395 Patton rationally explained that it was either a fish entangled in the net or a basking. 385 S. MacDonald, Old World Survivals in Ross Shire, Folklore 14, 1903, 368-369. 386 E. Lovett, Difficulties of a Folklore Collector, Folklore 20, 1909, 227. 387 E. S. Hartland, ed. County Folklore Printed Extracts. Number 1. Gloucestershire, London, 1892 p. 7. 388 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 15. 389 S. Young, Fairy Holes and Fairy Butter, in S. Young and C. Holbrook, eds. Magical Folk, British and Irish Fairies 500 AD. To the Present, London, 2018 p. 93. 390 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 204. 391 Freeman, Folklore Collection and Social Investigation, 60. 392 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 12. 393 Bennett, Traditions of Belief, p. 194. 394 S. MacDonald, Survivals in Ross Shire, 369. 395 C. I. Patton, Belief in Fairy Fishermen, Folklore 49, 1938-50. 43. Shark. 396 There is an inherent tension and conflict of meaning when collectors encounter supposed first-hand fairy sightings. In Connaught, George Kinahan encountered some people who claimed the fairies had beaten them. He doubtfully remarks, certainly they had been beaten by someone or something, and their neighbors firmly believed that it was the good people who did it. 397 As Timothy Corrigan notes, critics of fairy beliefs sought to rationalize fairy experiences rather than paying attention to performance of belief, as more recent scholars do. 398 For collectors, the fantastical and active nature of fairy lore posed problems. Sightings needed to be rationalized as the folks' interpretations based on their ancient beliefs. How faithfully informants' material was recorded and reproduced was problematic in an era before recording technology. Furthermore, the collector held the power of transcription and distribution. D. Ashleman notes that many collectors, driven by book buyers' expectations, desired to improve informants' language by altering tales told in difficult-to-understand dialects. 399 He notes, printable material was either omitted or bowdlerized. 400 Yet the FLS, committed to scientific accuracy, consistently reiterated the need for recording material as faithfully and accurately as possible. In 1878, William Ralston impressed upon collectors the absolute necessity of accurately recording the stories they hear, noting that any improvement deprives the result of any value, except amusement. 401 Hartland, in Science of Fairy Tales, also stressed that Any attempt to soften down inconsistencies, vulgarities, or stupidities detracts from the value of the text, and may hide or destroy something that was of importance to science. 402 Whilst more general folk tale collections or travel books may have altered or improved their material to suit readers' expectations, the FLS, at least theoretically, placed great importance upon accuracy. Folklorist and novelist Marie-Clotilde Baffour's recordings provide a particularly interesting example of fieldwork methods and how folklorists wrote up their collected materials. 403 Neil Philip raised doubts over the authenticity of these sufficiently strange stories. 404 Yet an unusual level of insight into her collection methodology is provided by her articles. Indeed. 396 Patton, Fairy Fisherman, 50. 397 G. H. Kinahan, Notes on Irish Folklore, The Folklore Record for 1881-98. 398 T. C. Carell, Believers, Skeptics, and Charlatans, Evidential Rhetoric, The Fairies and Fairy Healers in Irish Oral Narrative and Belief, Folklore 116, 2005-15. 399 D. Ashleman, Fairy Lore, A Handbook Westport, 2006 p. 167. 400 Ashleman, Fairy Lore, p. 168. 401 W. R. S. Ralston, Notes on Folk Tales, The Folklore Record 1, 1878-72. 402 Hartland, Science of Fairy Tales, p. 22. 403 See also, Simpson and Roud, Dictionary of English Folklore, p. 14. C. Blacker and H. E. Davidson, Introduction, in C. Blacker and H. E. Davidson, eds. Women and Tradition, A Neglected Group of Folklorists, Durham, 2000 p. 8. 404 N. Philip, ed. Penguin Book of English Folk Tales, London, 1992 p. 156. See also, J. Hart, Explore Fairy Traditions. Marlborough, 2004 pp. 18-19. James has argued that the stories demonstrate an authentic record of Lincolnshire folk tales. 405 Balfour took short notes, and wrote them out fully, on arriving home within a day of hearing the stories. 406 She tried to keep, strictly, to what she heard, presenting, in consequence, and even incoherency, in her folktale collections. 407 In one article she replicated her field notes and then provided her reconstituted version of the story, albeit sometime after the recordings were made. James notes these show a different style from her other tales, with less dialect features than the stories she wrote up directly after hearing a tale. 408 They nevertheless provide insight into her reconstruction methodology. In Sam'el's Ghost, her short field notes and reconstruction read: What's ghost? Bogles. Core. Oh, dead folk walks. Them bogles and fetches heard of lots seen none read in Spinney at home. Lad headless seen by mother when light at Yule invisible hand if stop at door, someone pretty or creepy prefer creepy tales, like, moon. 409. A doant know as a unerston, what de mayan by, ghostus. Ef dis baix o bogles, nao, or core or such. Ooh, diod foic as walks. Av heard uncalled bogles and, fetches, and, av heard on hayaps, can't see as a seed oni massel. There's a red woman as walks I, th, spinny nigh we're a duel, and, there were a lad why, ne'er a hayed on unat ma mother seed, wanna were a maid. An o yule, there's a Lloyd as is cart about th, town, ani none can't see th, han, as cars it, and, ef, t stops at a dorsal, sumune, die I, that haos a 4 th, years out. 410. Her work attempts to reconstruct and replicate the dialect and mannerisms of her informant via her memory and rough notes. 411 Without voice recorders accurate transcription was extremely problematic. Pauses, colloquialisms, and side notes had to be captured by the writing up process. 412 Bennett notes that it was usual practice to rewrite oral narratives by tidying up the wording, tightening the narrative line, and making sure it acquired a literary shape and polish. 413 Balfour deviates from this by heightening the dialect in the story. Phillips argued that Balfour's presentation of dialect was inaccurate, varying considerably from Mabel Peacock's. 405 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, pp. 195-196. 406 Balfour, Legends of the Cars 3, 401. 407 Balfour, Legends of the Cars 3, 401. 408 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, pp. 167 to 168. 409 Balfour, Legends of the Cars 3, 418. 410 Balfour, Legends of the Cars 3, 414 to 415. 411 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, pp. 161 to 163. 412 Bennett, Traditions of Belief, p. 19. 413 Bennett, Traditions of Belief, pp. 19 to 20. 45. Tales and Rhymes in the Lindsay Folk Speech, 1886. 414 However, James has extensively demonstrated that Balfour's legends resemble oral stories, particularly as they include many performance strategies. 415 Sadly, Balfour did not publish her field notes for the tales of The Stranger's Share, 416, Yallery Brown, 417 and Tiddy Moon, 418, which contain rich and unique relations of fairy creatures. After these unique articles, James notes that the FLS seemed to have discouraged Balfour from collecting stories direct from the people, 419, directing her towards the reiterative county folklore series. A hierarchical distinction between field collectors and the theoretical armchair folklorists is apparent. In 1878, Ralston noted the functions of collector and commentator differ widely, alluding to a division in labor. 420 Whilst collectors required patience and industry, the examiner also required exceptional prudence and cautiousness, and the theorizer who would make sense of the scattered fragments required deep learning. 421 Gom, in The Antiquary, acknowledged the division between the collectors of facts and those who use these facts to advance human knowledge into another phase. 422 Anthropologists relied upon data gathered by gentlemen amateurs abroad. 423 Women, lesser county members, and imperial officers were seen as perfect fieldworkers for folklore collection to provide source material for theoretical works. Dorson argues that none of his great team engaged in field collecting. 424 He even suggests a national division between the daring systems and ingenious speculations of English writing desks and the prodigies of field collecting, by Gaelic-speaking fieldworkers. 425 In Ireland there was certainly an increasing focus on fieldwork during the early 20th century, as evidenced by the voluminous collections of Westrop, which will be discussed in Chapter 4. 426 Nevertheless, this division of work was not as inflexible as first portrayed. In 1898 Lang, whilst on holiday in the Highlands and Islands, was reduced to angling for legends among the country people. 427 One informant, when asked about elf shot, produced a pot of Neolithic arrowheads for Lang. 428 Rees, during summer holidays in his native Wales, collected material which was later incorporated into Celtic folklore. 429 Even when waiting for a train at Abbey. 414 Philip, ed. English Folktales, p. 156. 415 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 172. 416 Balfour, Legends of the Cars 2, 278 to 283. 417 Balfour, Legends of the Cars 2, 264 to 271. 418 Balfour, Legends of the Cars I, 149 to 156. 419 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 49. 420 Ralston, Folk Tales, 73. 421 Ralston, Folk Tales, 73. 422 Gom, Antiquary Folklore Society, 15. 423 Stocking, Ethnographer's Magic, p. 18. 424 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 216. 425 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 316. 426 M. Fitzgerald, Thomas Johnson Westrop, 1860–1922, An Irish Antiquary, Dublin, 2000 p. 37. 427 A. Lang, A Creelful of Celtic Stories, Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, Dec. 1898, 792. 428 Lang, Creelful of Celtic Stories, 794. 429 Rees, Celtic Folklore, Volume 1, p. 193. Door Station in Herefordshire. Rees spoke to Elizabeth Williams, who related some household fairy lore from when she was a servant near Andelo Cresceny in Monmouthshire. 430 Juliet Wood argues that Dorson misjudged Riz's collecting skills, noting that Riz was able to deal easily, on the basis of shared language alone with any of his countrymen. 431 High-profile FLS members did engage in some collecting. However, their theoretical work was more prominent and, perhaps due to their mainly urban locations, collection of folklore in rural areas was left as a holiday activity. Theorizing was implicitly seen as more prestigious than fieldwork, meaning that oral collection naturally became of secondary status with folklore collection becoming more bookish. Ashton argues that the doctrine of survivals encouraged the prevalence of comparative, reiterative armchair scholarship, which relegated fieldwork to the status of secondary activities practiced only around the Celtic fringe and the Empire. 432 Dorson notes that the English enthusiasts' primary objective was not amassing materials but the scientific use of those that already lay at hand. 433 Arthur Wright himself, with nods to Thoms, acknowledged that the lassitude to collection had arisen from the vague impression that the big harvests of folklore facts have already been garnered, and that there were only a gleaning of scanty sheaves left. 434 Dorson notes that due to a leisurely attitude, in general less than a dozen collections were based even partly on fieldwork between 1865 and World War I. 435 One of these was Guernsey Folklore 1903, collected by Edgar McCullough and later edited into a published volume by Edith Carey, see Appendix 1. As will be explored, the County Folklore series gave priority to printed works. Nevertheless, the supposed subordinate role of the collector-compiler shifted over the era. For most of the 19th century, as Roger Luckhurst notes, the field collector was a lowly and unreliable figure, whose information had to be returned to the imperial center and judged by experts. 436 However, this pattern appeared to be changing, especially with the publication of the handbooks 1890 and 1914, aimed at professionalizing and standardizing folklore fieldwork methodologies. 437. 1.2 The County Folklore Series 1892-1914. The FLS focused on collecting together and reprinting scattered print materials from obscure local sources, such as newspaper cuttings, to make these more easily accessible for members too. 430 Rees, Celtic Folklore, Volume 1, p. 192. 431 Wood, Folk Narrative Research, 329. 432 Ashton, Beyond Survivalism, 19-20. See also. M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 49. 433 Dorson, Great Team of English Folklorists, 6. 434a. R. Wright, Presidential Address, The Unfinished Tasks of the Folklore Society, Folklore 39, 1928-19. 435 Dorson, British Folklorists, pp. 319-320. 436 R. Luckhurst, Knowledge, Belief in the Supernatural at the Imperial Margin in N. Bone, C. Burdett and P. Thirschwell. eds. The Victorian Supernatural, Cambridge, 2004 p. 212. 437 Gom, ed. Folklore Handbook, Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. 47. Study. From the beginning the Notes section in the FLS journal performed this role. For example, one cutting entitled, The Changeling, from Kilpatrick in Scotland concerns a modernized text of an old and mutilated manuscript found between the leaves of a large family Bible. 438 Another extract entitled, Fairies Under Trees was reprinted from the Shrewsbury Chronicle of 3 November 1882. 439 In another example, W. A. Craigie communicated a story regarding a fairy dog's tooth, which was abridged from an article entitled, Witchcraft in Lewis, appearing in the Weekly Scotsman of 5 August 1899. 440 The 1890 handbook noted that there was still much library work to be done, with items lying hidden in inaccessible or unknown books and in need of sorting, docketing, and preparing for use by the student. 441 In 1890 there was a request for volunteers to help compile a folklore bibliography, by forwarding references or cuttings in English local newspapers and journals that are likely to escape notice, as well as books and pamphlets published in the provinces. 442 This would involve long hours in libraries searching for and copying out items to send to the Society for publication. Whilst collection on a large systemized scale never fully materialized, scraps of ephemera always found a home in the FLS journal, providing wider access to obscure materials which could be used in theoretical research. Against this backdrop, the County Folklore series commenced with a grand plan to collect together printed extracts of folklore from every British county. Miller has previously traced the rise and fall of this series, which ultimately failed after just 7 volumes, see Table 1. 443. By analyzing how fairies were treated within the series, this section traces the reasons why this highly ambitious project eventually collapsed after 1914 and how this mirrors the FLS's wider decline in influence. It traces a chronology from ambitious beginnings in 1892, through very few contributors, difficulties accessing materials, apathy surrounding the series' purpose, and finally the Society's dwindling publishing power after World War I. Buoyed by the successful 1891 International Folklore Congress, the FLS sought to further consolidate its profile by proposing this ambitious series. 444. The series was to be made available to all members as the annual extra volume. 445. The Council proposed that numerous local committees could prepare folklore items for reprint from local histories, old chronicles, notes and queries, and other similar sources which lay scattered and inaccessible. 446. If one voice dissented, we can assume there would be others. Georgina Smith highlights that often folklore materials were so. 438. Folklore Society, Notes, The Folklore Record 1, 1878, 235. 439. Folklore Society, Notes and Queries, The Folklore Journal 1, 1883, 90-91. 440. W. A. Craigie, A Fairy Dog's Tooth, Folklore 11, 1900, 451. 441. Gom, ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 173. 442. Folklore Society, Notes and News, Folklore 1, 1890, 269. 443. Miller, The County Folklore Series, 327-344. 444. Miller, The County Folklore Series, 327. 445. Bennett, English Rural Myth, 84. 446. Folklore Society, 14th Annual Report of the Council, Folklore 3, 1892, 132. Scattered researchers faced little chance of utilizing, or even discovering, the existence of a small part of the locally available writing. 447. By drawing upon regional expertise, the County Folklore series attempted to solve this problem. Bennett suggests the series involved armchair scholarship, and an attempt at a salvage operation. 448. It was hoped the series would promote folklore as a science, compile together printed knowledge of the subject matter, and act as a comparative resource for any oral material collected in the future. Despite covering printed and historical materials, Bennett notes the series appears to follow the same theoretical conventions of oral collecting, focusing on rural counties, rather than major centers of population, where folklore was thought most likely to survive. 449. If completed, the series would have constituted an unparalleled library of British folklore, enabling subscribers easy access to an unprecedented amount of categorized regional material. Table 1. Volumes of the County Folklore Series, 1892-1914. Volume 1, 1895. 1. Gloucestershire, edited by Edwin Sidney Hartland. 2. Suffolk, collected and edited by Lady Evelyn Camilla Gordon with introduction by Edward Clodd. 3. Leicestershire and Rutland, collected and edited by Charles J. Bilson. Volume 2, 1897, North Riding of Yorkshire, York and the Ansty, collected and edited by Eliza Gutch. Volume 3, 1903, Orkney and Shetland Islands, collected by G. F. Black and edited by Northcote W. Thomas. Volume 4, 1904, Northumberland, collected by Marie Clotilde Balfour and edited by Northcote W. Thomas. Volume 5, 1908, Lincolnshire, collected by Eliza Gutch and Mabel Peacock and edited by Northcote W. Thomas. Volume 6, 1912, East Riding of Yorkshire, collected and edited by Eliza Gutch. Volume 7, 1914, Fife, collected by John Ewart Simpkins and edited by Charlotte Byrne. In 1892, Hartland edited a short first installment, Specimen, covering Gloucestershire, suggesting a model for the County Folklore series. 450. Ashton argues that the series displays the primacy of literary scholarship by only accepting items culled from previously published sources. 451 From the beginning, the choice to focus solely upon previously printed, rather than newly collected oral material, seemed unusual, due to the theoretical perception that folklore. 447 G. Smith, Literary Sources and Folklore Studies, 32. 448 Bennett, English Rural Myth, 84. 449 Bennett, English Rural Myth, 85. 450 Folklore Society, 14th Annual Report, 133. 451 J. Ashton, Rushed Bottomed Chairs and Ivory Towers, S. O. Addy and the Folklore Society, The Folklore Historian 15, 1998. 5. 49. Was dying out, we might expect more immediacy to collect oral material. For Hartland, the series was a starting point against which to verify other collected material. This helps to explain the focus exclusively upon printed materials. 452 The County Folklore series was seen as a foundation upon which oral collections could be categorized and analyzed. 453 Oral folklore was therefore implicitly given secondary importance. This bookish model of folklore disappointed some members who considered fieldwork of primary importance. Ashton convincingly argues that Sidney Addy, who suddenly departed from the FLS in 1905, was clearly unhappy with the lack of fieldwork and the focus upon reiterative scholarship. 454 In 1902 Addy complained of the little attention paid to folklore collection in England. 455 In another article, Addy directly attacked the County Folklore series, noting that the old books it requoted were unlikely to perish, whilst old informants were dying every year. 456 Ashton argues that Addy voiced ideological opposition to projects which could be seen to devalue fieldwork by favoring reiterative armchair scholarship. 457 Georgina Smith notes that there was a growing disenchantment with armchair scholarship. 458 This only grew as the series progressed. Despite forming a template of readily accessible material to guide field collectors, the reiterative nature of the series limited its scope. As a centralized FLS project, it is surprising that categories recommended in Gom's handbook were not applied in Heartland's guiding example, which interestingly does not mention fairies. It was only in the third installment, covering Leicestershire and Rutland, in 1895, that Charles J. Bilson finally incorporated Gom's categorization system, see Figure 1. He suggested that by adopting the system for all forthcoming volumes, the critical work of reference and comparison will be greatly facilitated. 459 Within this categorization structure, fairies and ghosts are included within goblindom, but Bilson only includes two short items on fairies. 460 By suggesting the use of Gom's categories, Bilson hoped to create a unified body of work aimed at scientifically analyzing scraps of folklore. By placing the items into a taxonomy-like system, it was hoped that they could be compared as a geologist might compare rocks or a biologist organic specimens. After Bilson's guidance, all future volumes employed this template, albeit sometimes loosely. It took 3 printed sections, which make up Volume 1, to finally establish a unifying template for the series, indicating a lack of clarified organization principles from the project's beginning. 452 Heartland, ed. County Folklore Gloucestershire, p. 5. 453 Heartland, ed. County Folklore Gloucestershire, p. 5. Dorson, Great Team of English Folklorists, 5. 454 Ashton, Rushed Bottomed Chairs, 10. 455 S. O. Addy, The Collection of Folklore, Folklore 13, 1902, 297. 456 Ashton, Rushed Bottomed Chairs, 12. 457 Ashton, Rushed Bottomed Chairs, 10. 458 G. Smith, Literary Sources and Folklore Studies, 38-39. 459 C. J. Bilson, ed. County Folklore Printed Extracts No. 3, Leicestershire and Rutland, London, 1895 Prefatory Note. 460 Bilson, ed. County Folklore Leicestershire, pp. 41-44. Figure 1. Contents page showing classification of folklore material based on schema from G. L. Gom's Handbook of Folklore from C. J. Bilson, ed. County Folklore Printed Extracts No. 3, Leicestershire and Rutland, London, 1895. Lady Camilla Gurdon's second section of the first volume on Suffolk helps to illustrate some methodological problems faced by FLS members compiling the series. Her section contains several entries from the Ipswich Journal, including a snippet concerning the local fairy names. 51. Frary and Pharisee. 461 such sources conform to the practice of collecting newspaper and periodical clippings as recommended by the FLS. However, not all the clippings are recorded, with a full reference to the authority, as requested by the Society's guidance. 462 for one excerpt, which recalls a mermaid who would chrome, or hook the children into the water. No month is given and a question mark appears next to the year 1877. 463 This demonstrates the difficulty of transcribing items from journals, borrowing others' notes or perhaps only having access to clippings without detailed reference notations attached. If Gurdon's quotes are compared to the original sources, more minor inconsistencies become apparent. Gordon includes fairy items from an appendix in Hollingsworth's History of Stowmarket. 464 Whilst Hollingsworth's actual title is just Fairies, Gordon, perhaps for more local flavor, adds her own title as Stowmarket Fairies. Farriers or Farishers. 465 In another example, she cites William of Newburgh's story of the Green Children of Woolpit using John Murray's Handbook for Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. 466 Gordon removes a sentence which was included at the end of the story in Murray's Handbook. The bell ringing, the river, and the green color of the children, all belong to true old, fairy mythology. 467 This might have been omitted for containing analysis and opinion. Nevertheless, Gurdon's categorization of the story under fairy also places an overlay upon the tale. Comparing items in the County Folklore series with the original sources helps to elucidate the compiler's working methodologies. Minor changes occurred during the transcription and editing process. The compilation task, involving long hours copying extracts, was probably rather tedious and therefore lacked appeal for dilettante interests. Likewise, a culture of requoting and reprinting a limited pool of items is evident. Under the category of folk tale, Gordon includes Tom Tit Tot, from A. W. T.'s Anna Walter Thomas contribution to the Ipswich Journal. 468 This story was told by an old servant to the writer when a child, most probably in the 1850s, and written down in Suffolk dialect in her later life. 469 The tale became highly culturally significant. Claude wrote the volume Tom Tit Tot, 1898, using this tale as a departure point from which to unpack the savage philosophy sitting behind the story. 470 is a reference Claude used old copies of the Ipswich Journal, which had 461 E.C. Gordon, ed. County Folklore Printed Extracts No. 2, Suffolk, London, 1893 p. 33. 462 Folklore Society, 15th Annual Report of the Council, Folklore 4, 1893, 113. 463 Gordon, ed. County Folklore Suffolk, p. 36. 464 Gordon, ed. County Folklore, Suffolk, pp. 36-39. 465a. G. H. Hollingsworth, The History of Stowmarket, the Ancient County Town of Suffolk, Ipswich, 1844 pp. 247-248. 466 Gordon, ed. County Folklore, Suffolk, pp. 33-34, J. Murray, Handbook for Suffolk, Norfolk, and Cambridgeshire, London. 1870 pp. 169-170. 467 Murray, Handbook for Essex, p. 170. 468 Simpson and Roud, Dictionary of English Folklore, p. 363. 469 Gordon, ed. County Folklore, Suffolk, pp. 43-48. See also, Philip, ed. English Folktales, p. 166. 470 Claude, Tom Tit Tot. Been sent to Francis Hines Groom for his Notes and Queries column, by Thomas. 471 In this bundle Claude also found Capo Rushes, Thomas's version of King Lear. Gordon may have also been working from this bundle as she also quotes Capo Rushes just above Tom Tit Tot. 472 Jacobs also adapted Tom Tit Tot for English Fairy Tales 1890, which turned the Ipswich Journal article into a popular Victorian nursery tale. 473 Hartland also includes a version of Tom Tit Tot in English Fairy and Other Folk Tales 1890. 474 citing Claude's earlier article, Philosophy of Rumpelstiltskin, 1889, as his source. 475 Teverson notes such fairy tales were considered as a kind of common property. 476 But Thomas was unhappy about the proliferation of her story without due credit from Jacobs and wrote to the Times to set the record straight. 477 It provides an example of how female collectors' names became overshadowed by gentlemen folklorists who had academic status and publishing power. From one small entry in the Ipswich Journal, Tom Tit Tot became a sensation, not only discussed in academic fields, but also told in nurseries. It demonstrates the thriving use of clippings which were regularly repurposed. Briggs complained folklorists handed round and round among them a small bundle of pretty fancies which became successively more threadbare. 478 It further reinforces the apparent issues some members had with reiterative literary scholarship. Volume 2 for North Riding of Yorkshire, York and Ainsty, 1901, edited by Eliza Gutch, employs Gomb's suggested categories, fully establishing a template for the rest of the series. 479 Categories provided readers with a useful means to navigate the information. Under the section of Goblindom, Gutch includes wraiths, exorcisms, manifestations, barguests, the devil, and fairies. 480 However, such categories are never completely discrete. Gutch noted many cross-references where she needed to seek counsel from Heartland on some occasions. 481 For example, under fairies, she includes an excerpt from M. C. F. Morris's Yorkshire folk talk concerning an old inhabitant who saw fairy figures, gaily clad, of full size, and in rapid confused motion, on early summer mornings. 482 Under this excerpt Gutch directs readers to a reference, located in the Natural Objects category, which refers to a curious cavern at Grinton with a deep pool of water known as the Fairies' Hole. 483 She also. 471 Claude, Tom Tit Tot, p. 8. 472 Gordon, ed. County Folklore, Suffolk, pp. 40-43. 473 Jacobs, ed. English Fairy Tales, pp. 1-9. 474 Heartland, English Folk Tales, pp. 28-34. 475 Claude, Philosophy of Rumpelstiltskin, 135-163. 476a. Teverson, Fairy Tale, London, 2013, p. 39. 477 Teverson, Fairy Tale, p. 40. 478 Briggs, Fairies in Tradition and Literature, London, 2002, p. 240. 479e. Gutch, ed. County Folklore Volume 2. North Riding of Yorkshire, York and the Ainsty, London, 1901, she. 480 Gutch, ed. County Folklore, North Riding, pp. 83-134. 481 Gutch, ed. County Folklore, North Riding, she. 482 Gutch, ed. County Folklore, North Riding, p. 120. M. C. F. Morris, Yorkshire Folk Talk Characteristics of Those Who Speak It in the North and East Ridings, London, 1892, p. 240. 483 Gutch, ed. County Folklore, North Riding, p. 27. 53. Adds a reference to Pudding Pie Hill, another residence of the fairies, also categorized under natural or inorganic objects. 484 This type of cross-comparison creates an internal union within the volume, inviting readers to engage with comparative methodology. It also demonstrates that Gomb's categories could never be entirely distinct and that editors experienced problems deciding in which categories to place items. Gutch's referencing practice also encourages readers to look up external information and move around the volume seeking parallels between the texts. It essentially promotes engagement with the Victorian anthropological school of folklore's methodology by actively modeling comparative techniques. For example, she quotes George Young's A History of Whitby and Streaneshaw Abbey on fairy butter being a yellow soft fungus Tremella arborea, which was lucky when found in houses. 485 The reader is then guided to a story about fairy butter in John Atkinson's 40 Years in a Moorland Parish. 486 The Atkinson reference contains an anecdote about a lady who had fairy butter smeared on her gate. 487 In another example under the category of leechcraft, she discusses cattle cures for sudden excitement, or offshots, where the cattle were thought to be shot at with these implements by the fairies. 488 Under this excerpt she guides readers to the subject of thunderbolts on page 14. The extract on thunderbolts, in a circular reference, guides readers back to page 181 to the excerpt on sudden excitement. Offshots. 489. This demonstrates the volume's strong internal unity. Readers are also guided to an external source, R. Blakeborough's wit, character, folklore, and custom of the North Riding of Yorkshire, which explains that the flint arrowheads were worn as charms against unseen evils and Belemnites were called thunderbolts. 490. Gutch's work contains many examples of such references, creating a network of internal and external comparisons within the text. The methodology of folklore is built within the framework of Gutch's volume and also the wider series. The book can stand alone as a source book or be used by more serious researchers with access to wider libraries of texts. At this early stage it seemed that the series was looking towards establishing a long run of volumes, built strongly on anthropological folkloric practices, and modeled on a centrally established FLS template derived from Gom's categorizations. 484. Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, p. 2. 485. Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, p. 130. 486. Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, p. 130. 487. J. C. Atkinson, 40 Years in a Moorland Parish Reminiscences and Researches in Danby and Cleveland, London, 1891 p. 53. 488. Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, pp. 181 to 182. 489. Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, p. 14. 490. Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, pp. 180 to 181. R. Blakeborough, Wit, Character, Folklore and Customs of the North Riding of Yorkshire, London, 1898 p. 141. The series also plays into the FLS's model that folklore and fairies belonged in a rural landscape. Despite York being an urban center, Gutch's introduction to Volume 2 engages in romantic impulses towards a rural countryside, or as Bennett defines the English myth. 491. Bennett argues that Gutch worked around the urban defect by stressing the rural setting and the antiquity of York, equating it with fairyland. 492. York is described as the mother city of the Shire of Broad Acres. 493. Gutch also describes the project as a kind of fairy tale quest, an stripling of storyland ever set forth with lighter heart to fulfill the strange behest that should win the hand of the princess, than did I, when I undertook to bring together such record as had been made in print. 494. Despite being a bookish work of library research, the sentiment of rural nostalgia spills into this project and gives it impetus, perhaps even leading to theoretical abandon. However, actual engagement with the rural population in the form of oral collection is notably lacking from the series. All the other volumes in the series concern more rural areas, and focus on rural material. No county folklore was produced for London. In 1903 Volume 3, by G. F. Black and Northcote Thomas, continued with a rural focus on the Orkney and Shetland Islands. The volume demonstrates a definite unity with the previous volumes in the series by following Gom's categorizations and Gutch's referencing style. The Goblindom chapter includes brownies, fairies, Loredan, Wilkie, poltergeist, and various. 495. Nevertheless, Thomas and Black use far less cross-comparison than Gutch, which creates a less interactive volume with a more passive reading experience. Furthermore, unlike Gutch's volume, there is a distinct lack of variety in the sources cited. For example, The Home of a Naturalist by Rev. B.O. Edmonston and his sister Jessie Saxby is heavily quoted in the Goblindom section. Excerpts on Shetland fairy tunes and stories of Shetland trows are included from them. 496. The tale of Catherine Fordyce of Unst, who was captured by the trows at the time of her child's birth, is also taken from Edmonston and Saxby. 497. A large section on trows is taken from Hibbert's A Description of the Shetland Islands. 498. Several items are taken from Burgess's Some Shetland Folklore. 499. Including the story, Trows Bundle, where the trows took a crofter's wife, leaving an effigy in her place. 500. The heavy use of few sources demonstrates that either little folklore material was available for this region, even in more obscure sources such as newspapers, or that the research was less comprehensive. Even in 491. Bennett, English Folklore, 27 to 35. 492. Bennett, English Rural Myth, 85. 493 Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, Ix. 494 Gutch ed. County Folklore, North Riding, Ix. 495 G. F. Black and N. W. Thomas eds. County Folklore Volume 3. Orkney and Shetland Islands, London, 1903 pp. 20-50. 496 Black and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Orkney, pp. 21-23. 497 Black and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Orkney, pp. 23-25. 498 Black and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Orkney, pp. 41-44. 499 J. J. Haldane Burgess, Some Shetland Folklore, Scottish Review 5, 1895, 91-103. 500 Black and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Orkney, pp. 32-33. 55. 1897 The annual report had noted that properly organized committees increases the probability of thoroughness in its performance. 501 Unfortunately these larger committees did not form as was hoped. Nevertheless, reproducing large amounts from a few texts would further add to the contentions of those who felt the series was a futile task of repetition. The series was beleaguered with shortages of volunteers and unforeseen circumstances caused issues with continuity. Black had brought together the material for Volume 3, but when he moved to the United States, Thomas took over the editorial task. 502 On completion, the council reported that Miss A. B. Henderson was working on Caithness, a volume that never emerged and no further trace of it can be found in folklore. 503 Volume 4 covering Northumberland was again edited by Thomas using the painstaking collection made some years ago by Balfour. 504 Indeed, Volume 4 was published in 1904, after Balfour had resigned from the FLS in 1902 and years after the manuscript was first presented. 505 Here we see Thomas editing yet another collection of notes made by a single individual. Out of the final 7 volumes, Thomas edited volumes 3 and 4 and also had an editorial hand in 5. Gutch compiled or helped to compile volumes 2, 5 and 6. Nonetheless, their guiding hand created a certain unity in the series. But the series failed to draw upon local expertise as it had been hoped. The FLS were building a library of works for members to collect together, but this also led to repetitions. Volume 4, Northumberland, 1904 demonstrates that the County Folklore series and other FLS publications had considerable overlap. 506 Thomas notes that the smallness of the volume was not due to the paucity of Northumberland folklore but because so much of it has already seen the light in the Society's publications. 507 For Brownie, Dobie, readers are guided to William Henderson's Notes on the Folklore of the Northern Counties, which was published by the FLS as the 1879 extra volume. 508 For Hobthrush, readers are guided to another FLS publication, the Denham Tracts. 509 There are several very short excerpts in the Goblindom section, and for many items the reader is merely guided to another FLS publication, see Figure 2. Whilst this underpins the unity of the FLS's corpus, it also means the County Folklore series, in certain instances, resembles a reference list. Short snippets and many references made the series less appealing to those with a general interest, as the linear reading. 501 Folklore Society, 19th Annual Report, 21. 502 Black and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Orkney, v. 503 Folklore Society, 20th Annual Report of the Council, Folklore 9, 1898-27. 504 M. C. Balfour and N. Thomas eds. County Folklore Volume 4, Northumberland, London, 1904 b. 505 M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 42. 506 Balfour and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Northumberland, v. 507 Balfour and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Northumberland, v. 508 Balfour and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Northumberland, p. 14. W. Henderson, Notes on the Folklore of the Northern Counties, London, 1879 pp. 247-248. 509 Balfour and Thomas eds. County Folklore, Northumberland, p. 18. J. Hardy, ed. Denham Tracts, a collection of folklore. Volume 1, London, 1892 p. 339. Experience is broken up. Maureen James highlights that the FLS were keen to remove overlapping items from Balfour's manuscript. 510. A prime example is the red cap, where Balfour reads a rhyme from Henderson to two ladies and only their reaction, "He's a real bad red cap," is printed, not the actual rhyme. 511. Any reader wishing to see the original rhyme would need to locate a copy of Henderson's Folklore of the Northern Counties and look up page 254, to find the song recorded by Mr. Wilkie. 512. Whilst the volume actively encourages readers to engage in their own armchair anthropology, the series heavily overlapped in purpose with other FLS publications. Furthermore, Folklore Journal and County Folklore series had some overlapping functions, both bringing items of local collectanea into the hands of FLS members. This again undermined the series' purpose, which further contributed to the indifference felt by FLS members who might have otherwise volunteered their help. Nonetheless, as Georgina Smith highlights, periodicals lacked indexes, materials were widely scattered, and presented a disorganized storehouse of data. 513. The County Folklore series had the benefit of presenting material in an organized manner. Nevertheless, other FLS publications usurped the series' purpose, therefore limited its appeal. Figure 2. Example of numerous reference listings in M. C. Balfour and N. Thomas, eds. County Folklore Volume 4, Northumberland, London, 1904 p. 14. 510. M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, p. 42. 511. Balfour and Thomas, eds. County Folklore, Northumberland, p. 18. 512. Henderson, Folklore of the Northern Counties, p. 254. 513. G. Smith, Literary Sources and Folklore Studies, 31. 57. Volume 5 for Lincolnshire, 1908, was again collected by Gutch, this time working with Peacock and supported by Thomas, who edited and arranged the material. 514. This further underlines the lack of wider commitment within the FLS membership. Peacock's preface indicates a slight apathy regarding the county, stating that, "The only striking characteristic of Lincolnshire folklore is its lack of originality, with many items merely disregarded as local variants of already familiar folklore." 515. Repetition gradually creeps in as the series progresses. This situation was compounded by the fact that neither Peacock nor Gutch were able to search through the back issues of the Stamford Mercury, other newspapers, or almanacs published by the booksellers of our small market towns, suggesting a reason for the lack of variety. 516. The section devoted to fairies and goblins is tiny, just 3 pages concentrating on small definitions and local names of creatures. 517. For example, the definition of fairy purses as a kind of fungus is taken from Edward Peacock's A Glossary of Words Used in the Wapentakes of Manly and Curringham, Lincolnshire. 518. From this glossary they also provide an example of the term changed. 519. It becomes apparent that they simply took the glossary and looked up the common fairy terms they knew. To offer local flavor, Gutch and Mabel Peacock fell back upon the regional dialect to provide Lincolnshire fairy names. For goblin names, J. E. Brogden's Provincial Words and Expressions current in Lincolnshire was used for terms including bogey, boggle bow, bugaboo, hobgoblin, and tut, tutgut, tom tit. 520. Brogden's book is again simply a glossary of dialect words. Readers are also directed to Mabel Peacock's article The Folklore of Lincolnshire, further underlining that the series regularly overlapped with material covered in the FLS journal. 521. The treatment of fairy creatures in Volume 5 reveals slim pickings. Perhaps this indicates a sense of malaise in the project. It might also demonstrate a large and demanding task falling upon too few members, who could not conduct it with sufficient thoroughness. Gutch was once again responsible for collecting Volume 6, The East Riding of Yorkshire, 1912. She formed the impression that the East Riding folk were more reticent of tongue and pen than other parts of Yorkshire, not believing that they were freer from superstition than their neighbours. 522. Again, the preface highlights a supposed lack of material available or suitable for the volume. Whilst this conforms to the theory that folklore was vanishing, it also displays Gutch's confirmation bias of this fact. In many ways, Volume 6 reveals little extra information about Gutch's treatment of fairies within. 514e. Gutch and M. Peacock, eds. County Folklore Volume 5. Lincolnshire, London, 1908 b. 515. Gutch and Peacock, eds. County Folklore, Lincolnshire, b. 516. Gutch and Peacock, eds. County Folklore, Lincolnshire, b. 517 Gutch and Peacock, eds. County Folklore, Lincolnshire, pp. 56-59. 518e. Peacock, a glossary of words used in the wapentakes of Manly and Curringham, Lincolnshire, London, 1875 p. 100. Edward Peacock is the father of Mabel Peacock. Miller, Lost Publications Folklore Society, 226-235. 519 Peacock, a glossary of words, p. 53. See also. M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, pp. 39-40. 520 Gutch and Peacock, eds. County Folklore, Lincolnshire, pp. 57-58. J. E. Brogden, Provincial Words and Expressions Current. In Lincolnshire, London, 1866. See also. M. James, Investigating the Legends of the Cares, pp. 39-40. 521 M. Peacock, The Folklore of Lincolnshire, Folklore 12, 1901, 161-180. 522 E. Gutch, ed. County Folklore Volume 6. East Riding of Yorkshire, London, 1912, She. The series. The volume confirms that the series' workload was becoming increasingly concentrated in a few hands. The final and seventh volume covering Fife, Clackmannan and Kinross Shires 1914 was compiled by John Ewart Simpkins, under the editorial guidance of Byrne. 523 It followed the series' well-established patterns of categorization, referencing, and citation. In the Goblindom section, fairies, brownies, kelpies, ignis fatuus, devils, ghosts, visions, wraiths, and second sight are all included. 524 However, with the dawning of World War I, this volume represented the end of the once highly ambitious plan. It reflects the general decline in the FLS from the heights of its determination and power in the 1890s. This can be paralleled with the premature ending of other group projects such as the Folktale Categorization Project after Cox's Cinderella, 1893, the difficulty completing a new edition of Brand's Antiquities, and the secession of the extra volume, which will all be discussed later. Grouped together, these projects demonstrate a culture of overreaching ambition which generally fell short due to lack of resourcing. The series did not enjoy the wide-scale volunteering effort the FLS had hoped for and was mainly produced by a few individuals. The 1893 annual report noted that hardly any local committees had formed, except for Leicestershire. 525 The 1897 annual report made a further plea for volunteers to form local committees and lighten the task. 526 This apathy signaled the series' fading fate. The task was laborious. Members were requested to copy the folklore with full references onto a single slip of paper. 527 Some members probably perceived the focus on previously printed texts, especially ones already printed by the FLS or commonly available, as pointless repetition. Even Hartland acknowledged the task was merely a foundation, before the more useful and far more interesting task of oral collection. 528 Furthermore, the society structure also helps explain why local committees failed to manifest. Miller notes that the FLS had a simple lack of members. 529 The membership was metropolitan-based, so the geographical coverage of membership was not sufficiently wide to form realistically large local groups able to spend considerable amounts of time in local libraries. 530 Furthermore, the series compilers were well known in English folklore studies. 531 These members had the knowledge, education, and experience to assemble the volumes which less experienced local members may not have had. All of these reasons explain why the project became heavily centralized. 523 J. E. Simpkins, ed. County Folklore Volume 7. Fife, Clackmannan and Kinross Shire, London, 1914, XV. 524 Simpkins, ed. County Folklore, Fife, pp. 31-35. 525 Folklore Society, 15th Annual Report, 114. 526 Folklore Society, 19th Annual Report, 21. 527 Folklore Society, 15th Annual Report, 114. 528 Hartland, ed. County Folklore, Gloucestershire, p. 5. Dorson, Great Team of English Folklorists, 6. 529 Miller, The County Folklore Series, 330. 530 Miller, The County Folklore Series, 331. 531 Miller, The County Folklore Series, 335. 59. Bennett cites lack of support, changing times, and sheer inertia as factors which killed the County Folklore series. 532. Our detailed and contextualized examination of the fairies' position within the text indicates that lack of manpower, structural weaknesses in the society, and perhaps the futility of regurgitating previously published material all contributed to the series' early discontinuation. Even in 1928, Wright noted that although work had been undertaken in numerous counties before the war, many had been abandoned or suspended through death or changed conditions. 533. Around the early 20th century, the first generation of organizing members passed away, including Gutchen 1931-534 and Thomas in 1936. 535. Lack of impetus or commitment from later members also explains why the series was not re-established after World War I. By 1910, the commitment to produce a new edition of Brandt's Antiquities covering calendar customs competed for the voluntary commitment of members and diverted their attention in a new direction. 536. Ultimately, the high paper prices and lack of funds after World War I prevented the series' publication. When Nutt, the Society's main publisher, died in 1910, the economically favorable publishing agreement the FLS had previously enjoyed ended, and with it their publishing power. 537. There were even 2 English county volumes that could have been published in 1928 if funds had been available. 538. The series was replaced by the more economical Scraps of English Folklore, in Folklore between 1924-1931, but Young notes they were no replacement for a comprehensive survey of British folk traditions. 539. 1.3 Charlotte Byrne and the Handbook of Folklore. Charlotte Byrne was born in Shropshire in 1850 to a wealthy family whose father was a scapegrace heir. 540. Her education and interest in antiquities was encouraged from a young age. 541. As a girl she kept a journal with notes on customs, epitaphs, and drawings of carvings, proving she was a serious collector from an early age. 542. Byrne joined the FLS in 1883-543 and was a member of the council by 1887. 544. Her most important regional collection, Shropshire Folklore, a sheaf of gleanings, came out in 3 volumes between 1883-1886, in which she. 532. Bennett, English Rural Myth, 85. 533. Wright, Unfinished Tasks of the Folklore Society, 33. 534. Folklore Society, 54th Annual Report of the Council, Folklore 43, 1932, 5. 535. Northcote W. Thomas and His Collection, Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, University of Cambridge. Last access 25 February 2019. 536. Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 13. A. Gom, The Collection of English Folklore, Ways and Means. Folklore 64, 1953, 326. 537. H. R. Tedder, Alfred Trubner Nutt, Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, last. Access 7 September 2017, E. Claude, In Memoriam, Alfred Nutt, 1856-1910, Folklore 21, 1910, 335-337, Death of Mr. Alfred Nutt. The Times, 24 May 1910, 13, Folklore Society, 15th Annual Report, 117. 538. Wright, Unfinished Tasks of the Folklore Society, 33. 539. S. Young, and a Historical Folklore Survey. A reply to John Widowson's New Beginnings, Folklore 129, 2018, 182. 540. Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 3. 541. J. C. Byrne, The Young Charlotte Byrne, author of Shropshire Folklore, Folklore 86, 1975, 168. 542. Bennett, Charlotte Sophia Byrne Update, 97. 543. E. S. Hartland, Obituary, Charlotte S. Byrne, Folklore 34, 1923, 99. 544. Hartland, Obituary, Byrne, 100. Edited and expanded upon her friend Georgina Jackson's collections. 545. This established her reputation as an accomplished collector. 546. She was the FLS vice president by 1901 and editor of Folklore between 1900-1908. 547. By 1910 she was the FLS's first female president. 548, but by 1918 she stopped attending council meetings due to declining health, representing the loss of another key member. 549. In the FLS, where women predominantly engaged in collection, translation or tabulation work, Byrne styled herself as a collector par excellence. She contributed several methodological articles to the FLS journal, joining the debate on the discipline's boundaries, categorization techniques, and collecting methods. 550. Classification of folklore. 551. Some simple methods of promoting the study of folklore. 552 and the collection of English folklore. 553 all demonstrate her growing reputation as an expert in collection methodologies and the chief apostle of fieldwork. 554 Gom nicknamed her the Queen of Folklore Collectors. 555 She emphasized the value of rapport with informants and importance of organizing collections. 556 She also called for the systematic collection of English folklore. 557 In her obituary Hartland acknowledged Byrne's experience as a collector, and appreciation of the meaning and methods of folklore. 558 This reputation allowed her to forge a leading role in the society without usurping the position of her more theoretical male colleagues. Ashman and Bennett note that it was virtually unique that as a collector she was allowed to penetrate the fastness of the FLS Council. 559 Bronner argues that her work marked a transition, from dilettante interest to professional research, from antiquarian purview to anthropological scope, and from library scouring to systematic field collection. 560 After her contribution to the 1890 handbook, in 1914 Byrne updated the handbook for a new generation focusing upon fieldwork methods in a global setting. 545 G. Ashman, Charlotte Byrne, in C. Blacker and H. E. Davidson, eds. Women and Tradition, A Neglected Group of Folklorists. Durham, 2000 p. 37, C. S. Byrne, Shropshire Folklore A Sheaf of Gleaning, 3 vols. London, 1883-1886. 546 See also, F. Bihet, Charlotte Byrne, Queen of Folklore Collectors, in S. Rout, ed. Proceedings of Locating Women in the Folk and Interdisciplinary Conference, University of Sussex, 9 June 2018 Forthcoming Sussex Traditions. 547 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 11. 548 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 280. 549 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 17. Unfortunately, it seems likely that Charlotte Byrne's papers and notes were destroyed by family members. Ashman, Charlotte Byrne Women and Tradition, p. 42. 550 C. S. Byrne, The Science of Folklore I, The Folklore Journal 3, 1885, 100. 551 C. S. Byrne, Classification of Folklore, The Folklore Journal 4, 1886, 158-163. 552 C. S. Byrne, Some Simple Methods of Promoting the Study of Folklore, and the Extension of the Folklore Society, The Folklore Journal 5, 1887, 62-65. 553 Byrne, Collection of English Folklore, 313-330. 554 Dorson, ed. Peasant Customs, Volume 1, p. 252. 555 Bennett, Charlotte Sophia Byrne Update, 97. 556 Bronner, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 16. 557 Bronner, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 16. 558 Hartland, Obituary, Byrne, 100. 559 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 1. 560 Bronner, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 15. 61. Byrne's 2 presidential addresses, emphasizing the importance of studying British country traditions to better understand international primitive peoples, were the most theoretical works of her career. 561 In The Value of European Folklore in the History of Culture, 1910 Byrne came close to undermining the theory of survivalism and comparative methodologies. She argued, how important it is to study difference as well as likeness, history as well as environment. 562 She then notes, No one, I think, will accuse me of wishing to undervalue survivals, and instead stresses the need to distinguish between survivals from different eras such as medieval and totemic. 563 Her work hints, in an embryonic form, at later ideas that folklore was not wholly fossilized and ancient, with new folklore being created in different eras. Byrne backs away from the ultimate conclusion of this line of thought, instead ending her speech with a plea for concentration on the methodical study of the folklore of our own country. 564 Bennett and Ashman argue that her speeches sent contradictory messages, on the one hand promoting systematic fieldwork and understanding folklore events in their own terms, whilst on the other, a constitutional unwillingness to challenge received opinion. 565 They argue she was a natural contextualist functionalist, who was caught in a straitjacket of received opinion, which she was reluctant to challenge. 566 However, perhaps such theoretical inconsistencies demonstrate that she used the speeches to express burgeoning theoretical ideas. FLS presidential speeches often addressed challenging topics or confronted prevailing theoretical ideas. Byrne, especially as a woman, succeeded in towing the theoretical line, whilst also employing the role of a female collector to influence the society. Ashman and Bennett argue that as a woman of her class without a university education, she would necessarily have been diffident about her right to express an opinion. 567 She carefully remained within the fold and achieved high status among what was frankly a difficult group of men. 568 Playing into gender delineations, Byrne once stated Heartland's suggestions for schemes of folklore classification were too elaborate for the weaker brethren, or at all events for the sisters, who certainly have a fair share of the work of collecting. 569 One reviewer of Shropshire folklore commented that Byrne's work had not attempted to step beyond the domain of English folklore into the dangerous but most fascinating paths of comparative folklore. 570 Byrne upheld the perceived. 561 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 280. 562 C. S. Byrne, Presidential Address, The Value of European Folklore in the History of Culture, Folklore 21, 1910-20. 563 Byrne, Presidential Address 1910, 32. 564 Byrne, Presidential Address 1910, 35. 565 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 15. 566 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 16. 567 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 9. 568 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 19. 569 Byrne, Science of Folklore I, 97. 570, Review, Shropshire Folklore, A Sheaf of Gleanings by Charlotte Sophia Byrne and Georgina F. Jackson. The Folklore. Journal 4, 1886, 367. Divide between collector and theorizer, falling on the side appropriate for upper-class women. Jennifer Fox notes that women folklorists often, unwittingly participate in their own oppression, by adopting the, inherently misogynistic, models for collection and interpretation, operating within the male-biased Western tradition. 571 Byrne clearly advocated and championed the secondary role of the collector, aiming to professionalize it. She harnessed a function performed by women and lower-status members, but raised its status, gaining respect and acceptance within the FLS leadership circle. 572 Byrne helped alter the shape of folklore, not by challenging consensus, but by highlighting what was already in practice. It was, however, left for Margaret Murray to be one of the first female folklorists to challenge the virtually exclusively male theoretical realm, with a controversial work for which she was reprimanded. During the early 1880s there was a growing awareness of the need for more strategized fieldwork methodologies and better categorization. The FLS Journal published numerous articles debating folklore's definition, methodology, categorization, and the science of folklore. 573 By 1886 a committee was formed to produce a handbook to guide fieldworkers with suggested questions divided into subjects. 574 The handbook was written by a committee, with various members contributing sections and also revising them. 575 Byrne wrote the greater part of the section on collecting folklore. 576 Gom completed sections on goblindom, place legends and traditions, and festival customs. 577 The volume published in 1890 set a blueprint and standard methodology for folklore collection which could be easily distributed for members to follow. It was designed to serve amateur collectors in the countryside. 578 The handbook not only acted to strategize collection methodologies by providing practical guidance but was also a vehicle to encourage more fieldworkers to collect folklore. 579 The initial chapter affirms the anthropological school's creed, highlighting that whilst anthropology deals with savage beliefs as customs in all their aspects, folklore is a subset which deals with the mental life of man. 580 Folklore survivals are portrayed as a means of penetrating to the prehistoric. 571 J. Fox, The Creator Gods, Romantic Nationalism and the Engenderment of Women in Folklore, The Journal of American Folklore 100, 1987, 564. 572 Bennett and Ashman, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 10. 573 G. L. Gom, Folklore Terminology I, The Folklore Journal 2, 1884, 316. E. S. Hartland, Folklore Terminology, The Folklore Journal 2, 1884, 340-344, H. B. Wheatley, Folklore Terminology, The Folklore Journal 2, 1884, 346-347, G. L. Gom, The Science of Folklore, The Folklore Journal 3, 1885, 1-16, Byrne, Science of Folklore I, 97-103, E. S. Hartland, The Science of Folklore, The Folklore Journal 3, 1885, 115-121, C. S. Byrne, The Science of Folklore 2, The Folklore Journal 3, 1885, 267-269, R. C. Temple, The Science of Folklore, The Folklore Journal 4, 1886, 193-212, J. S. Stuart Glennie, The Principles of the Classification of Folklore. The Folklore Journal 4, 1886, 75-79, J. S. Stuart Glennie. The Science of Folklore, The Archaeological Review 3, 1889, 197-205. 574 Gom, Science of Folklore, 1-16, Folklore Society, 8th Annual Report of the Council, The Folklore Journal 4, 1886, 370. 575 Folklore Society, Annual Report of the Council, Thursday 6 December 1888, The Folklore Journal 7, 1889, 3, Gom. Ed. Folklore Handbook, Preface. 576 Gom, ed. Folklore Handbook, v. 577 Folklore Society, Annual Report 1888, 3. 578 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 222. 579 Folklore Society, Annual Report of the Council 18 March 1891, Folklore 2, 1891, 502. 580 Gom, ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 4. 63. Past of Nations and Tracing Out Many of the Landmarks in the Mental Development of Man. 581 A chapter on library work underpins the collector-compiler model of folklore in which amassing both printed material and oral tales was important. The 1890 version also adopts a British-centric model of collection. In the 1890 handbook, fairies are situated within the goblindom category, under the superstitious belief and practice category. The broader categories, see Figure 3, are modeled upon Gom's suggestions in The Science of Folklore, 1885, where fairies as supernatural beings were originally fitted into the subcategory of superstitious practices and fancies. 582 However, Byrne suggested an amendment to Gom's 1885 categories which the handbook adopted. She noted that the superstitious practices and fancies category was too extensive. For example, a single incident tale relating a pixie who would not work when given new clothes, might not conveniently fit under the category of narrative but would be better placed under superstitions. 583 She therefore suggests the subcategory, goblindom, including items such as wish-hounds, fairies, brownies, and local demons. 584 Due to Byrne's intervention, goblindom was adopted as a clear subcategory in the schema, providing a delineated area for fairies. The denizens of goblindom are outlined as spirits, generally called fairy or goblin, that can be diminutive, gigantic, nimble, merry and clever, or heavy, plotting and stupid. 585 A lengthy list of names applied to these spirits, such as Brownie, Hob, Robin Goodfellow, Old Horny, and Vinegar Tom, is included. 586 The goblindom kingdom is divided into 9 subcategories: the elfin community, beautiful women, such as sirens or Lady of the Lake, household familiars, and drudging goblin, ancestral spirits, such as the banshee, individual uncomfortable demons haunting solitary places, ghost, the wild hunt, enchanted heroes, and beings who seem to represent ancient goddesses. 587 Examining the denizens of goblindom helps us understand that the term fairy could be applied very broadly and had very porous boundaries. However, the focus was strongly on British and European fairy types. The handbook provided precise guidance on how folklore could be categorized in a standardized way. The categories were by no means all-inclusive, or entirely comprehensive. Fairies could also be found, for example, in the subcategory of superstitions connected with great natural objects. 588 Nevertheless, the handbook provided a solid guide by which 581 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 5. 582 Gom. Science of Folklore, 9. 583 Bern. Science of Folklore I, 99. 584 Bern. Science of Folklore I, 100. 585 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 30. 586 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, pp. 30-31. 587 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, pp. 31-32. 588 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 9. Fieldworkers might usefully classify and sort their data modeled upon a disciplinary convention, even if this guidance remained strongly Western-centric. Figure 3. Classification schemes of folklore materials from G. L. Gom. ed. The Handbook of Folklore, London, 1890 p. 6. The handbook also provided practical suggestions in the form of question lists that fieldworkers could ask informants. Some open questions such as, give the names of the local demons. Have any of them personal proper names? And, form and appearance beautiful, hideous, small in stature, different at different times, aimed at gathering general information relating to fairies. 589 Other questions such as, do the fairies steal human beings or animals? 590 is the 589 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 34. 65. Household fairy supplied with food. 591 are clearly guided by a pointed knowledge of fairy lore and are searching for specific types of answer. Further questions such as, do human midwives assist fairies in childbirth? 592 are specific and closed and would only elicit confirmatory answers. Despite some lacunas in coverage and some very specific closed questions, the handbook lists represent the FLS's first attempt at standardizing its questioning methodology for oral folklore collection. The questions remain strongly modeled on the European conception of fairy lore. Nevertheless, it meant that answers to the same types of questions could be replicated up and down the country and material would therefore be more directly comparable between counties. By the early 1910s it was apparent the handbook required updating and Byrne was the obvious choice as editor. In the second edition, as Dorson notes, the folklore of the Isles has indeed yielded to folklore of the Empire. 593 The handbook is addressed to officers of the public services, to missionaries, travelers, settlers, and others whose lot is cast among uncivilized or half-civilized populations abroad, and then, to residents in country places at home. 594 Nathani explains that Byrne was trying to make her comments applicable as far, literally, as the limits of the British Empire. 595 The 1914 handbook made the world its field for collection and likewise fairies became subsumed into the anthropological exploration of colonial subjects' primitive mindsets. However, Byrne only had purely English experience of collecting, making the imperial focus somewhat problematic. 596 Despite this change in focus, Ashman and Bennett argue that the edition remained reverential to evolutionary ideas. 597 Bennett considers that as it left evolutionary principles unchanged, it was a lost chance for British folkloristics. 598 The first few pages restate the anthropological creed that folklore, in fact, is the expression of the psychology of early man. 599 and in all human societies, whether savage or civilized, we may naturally expect to find old beliefs, old customs, old memories, which are relics of an unrecorded past. 600 This reverence demonstrates Byrne's continuing unwillingness to challenge the Taylorian survivalism which still dominated the society. Nevertheless, she highlights that the handbook aims to steer clear of theory as far as may be, as, above all things, a collector of folklore should work independently from theory. 601 Byrne. 590 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 34. 591 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 35. 592 Gom. ed. Folklore Handbook, p. 35. 593 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 333. 594 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. b. 595 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 22. 596 c. S. Byrne, The Collection of Folklore, Folklore 13, 1902, 299-300. 597 Bennett, The Thomsian Heritage, 217. 598 Bennett, The Thomsian Heritage, 217. 599 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 1. 600 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 2. 601 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 5. Adopts a deferential approach to theoretical discussions, choosing to focus on the practicalities of collection. Byrne claimed to mainly uphold Gom's classification system, making only such modifications of details as experience and extended knowledge have shown to be desirable. 602 Yet on closer comparison, much of the classification system has been overhauled. The whole subcategory of goblindom has disappeared, and a new category of superhuman beings incorporates fairies along with goblindom's previous inhabitants. Byrne has clearly moved away from her own 1885 classification suggestions. She notes this new category of gods, godlings, and others reflects primitive man's theological beliefs in heathen gods, which are personified natural objects, or simply powerful unseen beings, supermen. 603 In the new category, Byrne works down from more important divinities to the smallest forms of beings such as genius loci and tutelary divinities. 604 The former inhabitants of goblindom, the various races of beings, not human and yet not divine, who are supposed to share this lower earth, more or less invisibly, with mankind, sit at the lowest rank in this new category. 605 This categorization demonstrates how fairies became subsumed into the wider subset of supernatural beings. The primitive people held active beliefs in gods and godlings, whilst they survived as fossilized beliefs in diminished gods, the fairies, in Britain and Europe. Rather than recording fairy anecdotes in a British context, the new edition of the handbook considers how fairies might fit into a global context of spiritual beliefs. By looking more holistically at the context of fairy beliefs, the act of fieldwork collection shifted closer to the anthropological sphere. In the 1914 handbook, Byrne's discussions connect the European fairy to its global cousins. Byrne discusses the Malay Hantus, the Burmese Nats, and the Arab Jinn as belonging to the same group. 606 The Egyptian Afrit, who appears from the blood of a murdered man, is directly compared to the various hobgoblins of Britain and Ireland, the Bargeist, the Boggart, the Bogey, the Buggan, the Boken, the PWCA, the Fuka, who haunt dark and uncanny places and terrify belated wayfarers. 607 The overseas is paralleled to the domestic, situating the British fairy as part of a global phenomenon. Bronner argues the 1914 handbook takes a world view. It was not enough to copy the texts, one also had to note the philosophies and contexts surrounding the lore. 608 The second edition's categorization system focuses on belief or function rather than creature. For instance, the household familiar can be discussed under the 602 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. b. See also Ashman, Charlotte Byrne Women and Tradition, p. 39. 603 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 92. 604 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 97. 605 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 97. 606 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 97. 607 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 98. 608 Bronner, Charlotte Sophia Byrne, 17. 67. Category of things made by man, as a genius loci or hearth spirit, in relation to everyday objects, such as furniture, becoming the subject to animistic beliefs. 609 In the 1914 handbook, fairies become lost amidst all the spirits. As anthropological awareness grew, use of local names and local contexts became more important. Fairies now sit as a Western version of the spirits believed in around the world. Byrne's edition of the handbook turns the eyes of collectors outwards to the empire. This correlates with Bernard Porter's argument that imperial propaganda was increased during this period, especially during World War I, in order to encourage people to commit more consciously to empire. 610. The 1914 handbook focuses more extensively on the methodological process of collection in the field. Freeman argues that it is preoccupied with problems of cross-class communication and strategies for the interrogation of respondents. 611. He argues that the methods seem strategic and calculated, valuing informants for the information they could convey rather than on their own terms. 612. Burns suggests employing tactics to help strike up conversations, such as searching stalls for amulets or deliberately spilling salt and feigning annoyance. 613. She also tells collectors it is unwise to produce one's notebook, which might make an informant suspicious and dry up the stream of information. 614. Byrne also warns that people, especially obsequious subject races, will give pleasant answers and complacently agree to suggestions. 615. Byrne's suggestions are concrete and consider cross-cultural and cross-class interactions. Some tips are incredibly practical, such as using a phonograph for recording songs. 616. Or writing in a notebook with detachable leaves to allow items to be sorted. 617. The 1914 handbook also omits the chapter on library research, indicating a renewed focus on gathering oral folklore. The questions section in the 1914 handbook was moved from a central position into an appendix as a supplementary guide. The questions regarding the elfin world sit at the bottom of a section on superhuman beings, which ask about the names, form, powers, worship, and sacrifice of gods and godlings. These elfin questions are no longer based on European concepts of fairy lore, but the wider general class of beliefs. The focus on fairy lore from the 1890 Goblindom section has been entirely swept aside. 618. For example, collectors are guided to ask, is there any belief in the elfin world, or in a race or community of anthropomorphic? 609. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 64. 610. Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 255. 611. Freeman, Folklore Collection and Social Investigation, 59. 612. Freeman, Folklore Collection and Social Investigation, 62. 613. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 12. 614. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 17. 615. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 15. 616. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 18. 617. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 18. 618. Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. pp. 316 to 319. But not human, yet not divine, beings, generally invisible but sometimes seen. 619. Questions are open, seemingly acting as an aid memoir or guidance for collectors, rather than a list of questions to read out and ask in the field. However, one or two of Byrne's suggested questions are still derived from the European conception of fairy lore. For example, did they frequent prehistoric grave mounds or other ancient remains? 620. The European fairies in Byrne's handbook are relegated and become subsumed within a global anthropological context. Her 1914 edition focuses upon the context of supernatural beings in global primitive belief systems. As fairies lost their central place in the FLS Collector's Manual, it demonstrates their predominance was already becoming eroded. Dorson notes that rather than marking the beginning of collecting in the Empire, Byrne's handbook marked the capping of an era. 621. 1.4 Collecting exotic fairies and fairy-like beings. Later Victorian society saw an increased assertion of imperialism and nationalism. Bernard Porter argues that in the early 19th century British society's experience of empire was class-dependent, and that empire did not need to have deep roots in British society. 622. He argues upper-class elites ran the empire, they were born to rule. 623. Stocking also highlights that the empire became more defensive after the Crimean War, Indian Mutiny and various protests, ushering in a new period when British hegemony could no longer be left so confidently to the forces of free trade. 624. Porter argues that during the 1870s and 1880s, more and more people were asserting their imperialism. 625 Empire and patriotism also provided a new, social adhesive, in the face of rising socialism. 626 Porter puts this pressure down to other countries expanding their empires, increasing electorates, social unrest, dwindling confidence in free market capitalism generally, thus making a new broader imperialism appealing. 627 He notes imperialism in the late 19th century took pride in spreading its benefits, victims had to be presented as beneficiaries. 628 Hartland even promoted studying folklore to help colonial officials rule imperial subjects with better understanding. 629 Hartland thought it was disgraceful that the government had no public institution to instruct anthropology to young. 619 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 320. 620 Byrne, ed. Folklore Handbook, 2nd ed. p. 320. 621 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 333. 622 Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 24. 623 Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 48. 624 Stocking, Victorian Anthropology, p. 241. 625 Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 167. 626 Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 168. 627 Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 169. 628 Porter, Absent-Minded Imperialists, p. 242. 629 E. S. Hartland, Folklore, What is it and what is the good of it? Popular Studies in Mythology, Romance and Folklore No. 2. London, 1899 pp. 35-38. 69. Men going out to British dependencies. 630 There was increasing awareness in the importance of understanding colonial cultures, including the supernatural beings of native belief systems. Nathani notes the need to redefine the colonial writings by moving scholarship beyond critique, negative or positive, and into those realms of colonial folklore scholarship about which there is silence. 631 This section endeavors to extend Nathani's reading by examining how material surrounding fairy-like creatures was collected against an imperialist backdrop. It examines how the European conception of the fairy was reconciled with wider global concepts of supernatural beings. Dorson notes some collectors felt the empire formed a living laboratory for Tyler's anthropological hypothesis. 632 Ephraim Sarah Schreier argues that the British Empire possessed a global network for gathering and exchanging information, allowing scholars in Britain to acquire data more easily. 633 The FLS took advantage of these networks to acquire information regarding exotic comparisons to the British fairy. By 1885 the FLS mooted whether local secretaries could be extended to foreign countries, and to India and the colonies. 634 The FLS's mission was to collect folklore on a global scale, using their position at the center of the British Empire to do so. The FLS, as Nathani notes, represented a unique space where folklore from the whole empire could be brought together for discussion. 635 She argues colonies were the same, whether for trade or for folklore studies, they supplied raw materials to be processed elsewhere. 636 Data was collected abroad, then sent back to Britain to be theoretically analyzed. Yet membership outside of Britain was extremely low. In 1881 there were just 10 members in Asia, 7 in India, and only 1 member in Africa. 637 By 1910 this had increased with 16 individual members, excluding libraries, in India, 4 members in Africa, including Rhodesia and Uganda, 3 in Australia, 2 in Fiji, 2 in the Malay Peninsula and 1 member each in Canada, New Zealand, Algiers, Antigua, Morocco and Wei. 638 Increasingly networks widened, so exchanges of ideas in the folklore field became more global, at least for the imperial class. However, as anthropology became more professionalized in the early 20th century, aims to understand native beliefs on their own terms increased. As anthropological fieldwork developed a fascination with supernatural and fairy-like beings of the empire and further afield, the familiar European fairy became universally contextualized. Focus. 630 Hartland, Folklore, What is it? p. 35. 631 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 52. 632 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 333. See also, Bennett, English Rural Myth, 88. 633 E. Sarah Schreier, What is Armchair Anthropology? Observational Practices in 19th Century British Human Sciences, History of the Human Sciences 27, 2014, 33. 634 Folklore Society, 7th Annual Report of the Council, The Folklore Journal 3, 1885, 390. 635 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 6. 636 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 55. 637 Gosden and Wingfield, An Imperialist Folklore, p. 268. 638 Folklore Society, Officers and Members, Folklore 21, 1910, IXVI. Shifted away from domestic folklore, and the FLS, into more anthropologically focused endeavors. During the late 19th century, collection within the imperial setting was underpinned by Taylorian concepts of culture. Colonial subjects were seen as representing primitive or even savage cultural phases when compared to their civilized British counterparts. Tyler saw the mythology of the world in its most distinct and most rudimentary form, when observing the quaint fancies and wild legends of the lower tribes. 639 Likewise, the savage was representative of the childhood of the human race. 640 Weeks notes that folklorists' practice of grouping cultures in judgmental terms, at the bottom of a cultural evolutionary ladder had very little to do with objective science, and everything to do with colonial culture validating itself. 641 Rachel Harris calls this an imperialistic system of self-aggrandizement. 642 For anthropological folklorists, all fairy-like supernatural beings in the colonies originated from lower cultural stages, as did European survivals of fairy lore. Many foreign supernatural beings were comparable to European fairies, but were not quite fairies. This caused a terminological disjuncture. European conceptions of fairies were employed to ease the understanding of foreign beings for British readers, but these analogies were uncomfortably imposed upon native beliefs. This section examines how FLS members outside of Britain gathered folklore about exotic, fairy-like beings, mediating themes of colonialism and Taylorian anthropology in the process. We move beyond Edward Said's examination of Orientalism, 1978, where the Orient is contained and represented by dominating frameworks. 643 The FLS's examination of the fairy is seen as a cultural exchange, albeit an unequal one, where the conceptions of colonial fairies also impacted upon the metropole. Dorson encapsulates the sentiment of folklore collecting in The Glorious Reign of Queen Victoria, under Pax Britannica, where Britishers traversed the globe and thought about folklore when they inspected exotic peoples and genuine savages. 644 For many colonial collectors, folklore was a secondary concern. They were primarily government officials, administrators, missionaries, wives, or perhaps business people and their employees. Folklore collection, as Dorson notes, was a seductive activity for the intellectually curious Briton residing abroad. 645 They collected on disciplinary principles forged in London, assuming local. 639 Tyler, Primitive Culture, Volume 1, p. 257. 640 Tyler, Primitive Culture, Volume 1, p. 257, J. A. McCulloch's title Childhood of Fiction hints at this Taylorian conception. J. A. McCulloch, The Childhood of Fiction, A Study of Folk Tales and Primitive Thought, New York, 1905. 641 Weeks, Fairies, Fairy Tales, pp. 324-325. 642 R. Harris, Picturing Fairyland, p. 69. 643 E. W. Said, Orientalism, London, 2003 p. 40. 644 Dorson, ed. Peasant Customs, Volume 2, p. 571. 645 Dorson, ed. Peasant Customs, Volume 2, p. 571. 71. Materials would conform to these categories. 646 Christian Bakalega and Sadhana Nathani highlight how colonial collectors' methodologies, perceptions, and policies remained significantly similar, being shaped by imported, Oretic, European folk narrative genres. 647 Collected material was also shaped to suit home audiences with set expectations, to be excited by exotic descriptions and findings that conformed to established theoretic models based upon British scholarly conventions. Often these expectations did not easily transpose onto native beliefs, presenting collectors in the field with difficulties. Nathani notes the sharp differences between English theoretical models and the realities of folklore collection in the colonies. 648 Bowdlerizing British theories often provided a template for facts on the ground. Likewise, central guides, such as the 1890 Handbook, were rife with Eurocentric suppositions about fairies which might not fit cultural conditions in practical reality. As previously considered, the 1890 Handbook focused on British fieldwork, and the 1914 Handbook that was more concerned with overseas collecting arrived, perhaps, a generation too late. An imperial collector was an outsider and a symbol of dominant power. This was further compounded by practical difficulties such as language barriers, problems understanding specific categories of supernatural creatures, and the subtle nuances of native cultures. Yet as anthropology became increasingly professionalized, there were greater attempts to understand exotic, supernatural beings on their own terms, and within their native context. By discussing the work of William Crook, John Henry Hutton, Beatrice Blackwood, and G.I. Davies, the shifting changes in collection methods are considered. William Crook was a central figure in Anglo-Indian folklore. 649 Growing up in Ireland with an English family, he was educated at Trinity College in Dublin, and joined the Indian Civil Service in 1871. During his career he was a magistrate and collector in the United Provinces of Agra and Oudh. 650 A workaholic, in addition to his official duties, he was interested in anthropology. 651 Nathani notes that he viewed his administrative subjects as anthropological objects, spending much time recording the region's culture and popular religion. 652 Upon retiring to England, he was an active FLS member, becoming president before World War I and folklore editor between 1915 and his death in 1923. 653 An Introduction to the Popular Religion and Folklore of Northern India was first published in 1894, but was practically rewritten, 654, and expanded into 2 volumes for the 1896 English edition. 655 The work, as Dorson. 646 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 36. 647 c. Bakalega and S. Nathani, Colonialism, Postcolonialism, and Decolonization, in p. Greenhill, J. Rudy, N. Hamer, and L. Bosque, eds. The Routledge Companion to Media and Fairy Tale Cultures, Abingdon, 2018, p. 84. 648 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 31. 649 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 341. 650 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, pp. 5-6. 651 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 12. 652 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 12. 653 H. A. Rose, In Memoriam, William Crook, 1848-1923, Folklore 34, 1923, 383. 654 W. Crook, Popular Religions and Folklore of Northern India, Volume 1, London, 1896 v. 655 Rose, In Memoriam, Crook, 383. Argues, sought to reconstruct the prehistoric pantheon of Indian gods and godlings from the extant rites and fancies of popular faith. 656 It is a comparative work, treating folk tales as a prime source for congealed belief, seeking British and European analogues to the Indian folk religion. 657 Crook highlighted that popular religion had a clear imperial purpose, for the use of all officers whose work lies among the rural classes to enable them to understand the mysterious inner life of the races among whom their lot is cast. 658 This corresponds with Heartland's vision for folklore, as a means to better understand natives, and therefore direct the paternalistic practices of imperial officials more equitably. 659. Dorson was in awe of Crook's remarkable achievement where he had to snatch time at a far remove from libraries. 660 However, Nathani's book In Quest of Indian Folktales 2006 highlights the important role Pandit Ram Garib Shabe, an Indian collector and graduate of Presidency College Calcutta, played in supporting Crook's publications. Crook hardly mentions Shabe despite working with him between 1892–1896, during which time Popular Religions and Folklore of Northern India was produced. 661 This reflects how the roles of assistants, narrators, and helpers were often silenced within a colonial context. Nathani notes that the labor of the colonized peoples was assumed to be the right of the British collector, therefore not worth mentioning. 662 Throughout popular religions, Crook's exclusion of Chaub's role, or any assistant's role, is extensive. 663 Crook does not explicitly signpost what he personally collected, or how it was gathered. A third-person narrator's voice, sounding like a factual account, subsumes the act of collection in the text. For example, when relating the story of an underwater fairy temple at Lake Taroba or Tadala in the Chanda district, no particulars of collection are related. Crook reports local, old men, recalling how one dry year the lake level was so low the fairy's temple was revealed. 664 There is no literary reference given, whilst some parts are in direct quotes suggesting the orality of the story. Crook provides parallels found in Western folklore scholarship, such as Hartland's Science of Fairy Tales, where this legend type was admirably illustrated. 665 He also cites Hunt's popular romances with a parallel from Cutton Point in Cornwall where revelries were heard beneath the waves. 666 Whilst Crook engaged an Indian collector, he perhaps felt that the folklore framework he personally provided. 656 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 341. 657 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 343. 658 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, b. 659 Hartland, Folklore, What Is It, pp. 35-38. 660 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 344. 661 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, pp. 6-7. See also, W. Crook, The Tribes and Castes of the Northwestern Provinces N. Oud, 4 vols. Calcutta, 1896. Whilst this volume is more anthropological in interest, it demonstrates the wealth of material that was gathered by Crook. 662 Nathani, Storytime of the British Empire, p. 44. 663 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 16. 664 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 57. 665 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 56. 666 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 56. 73. Added true scholarly value beyond the act of collection and recording. As discussed earlier in this chapter, fieldwork collection was an activity considered to have secondary status after analysis and theory. Crook perceived Chaub's role as supportive, perhaps as the labor of a clerk or housekeeper. Nathani argues silences of this type suggest half a conversation, like people listening to one side of a telephone conversation and deducing half the dialogue. 667 In 1900 Chabet wrote a 50-page letter to Crook. 668 And in 1902 Crook published some memories of his Indian collections. 669 Both help expand upon Chaub's extensive contribution. The British folkloric framework is continually played out in Crook's parallels. Dorson notes that, exotic as these creatures might seem to a rational Victorian, Crook was ever quick to perceive similarities with beliefs at home. 670 When discussing Bhumia, a godling who possessed people causing their hair to become hopelessly entangled, Crook parallels Walter Scott's letters on demonology relating the belief that, all who have communication with fairies find their hair all tied in double knots. 671 Seedala, the goddess of smallpox who is called euphemistic names, is also made relatable to British readers by paralleling her with the fairies, who are named the good neighbors. 672 In another example, boots, who are tall as palmyra trees, generally thin and very black. 673 Who frighten nighttime travelers and eat copious amounts of fish. 674 Are related to Riz's tale of a Manx fisherman pursued by fairy dogs when returning his catch home one night. 675 Seemingly exotic beliefs are rendered more relatable to British readers by paralleling them with similar European counterparts. The fairy is used as a guide to help British Victorian readers navigate India's pantheon of exotic supernatural beings. Materials from the colonies are taken and repackaged in a domesticated format. It reflects comparative folklore methodologies that considered similar belief patterns could be directly compared, despite being culturally decontextualized, due to the universal nature of primitive thought. Yet this template limited the understanding of stories within their own cultural context. Bakalega and Nathani highlight how the intimate relationship of narrative, place, and culture in non-European contexts was jeopardized when the narratives were disconnected from their native generic identification and categorized as fairy tales. 676 Rather than helping imperial officers understand native customs better, Crook's framework added a layer of distance and false parallel based on European folklore models. 667 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 46. 668 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 6. 669 W. Crook, The Collection of Folklore, Folklore 13, 1902, 303. 670 Dorson, British Folklorists, p. 342. 671 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 107. 672 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 126. 673 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 242. 674 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 242. 675 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 242. 676 Bakalega and Nathani, Colonialism, Postcolonialism, and Decolonization, p. 84. However, some creatures, such as the Peri, are not just akin to European fairies, they are labeled as actual fairies. For example, Ramba, who appears in the tales of Somadeva, is named one of the fairies of Indra's court. 677 These ladies appear faintly in the Veda as nymphs of Indra's heaven, the wives and mistresses of the Gandharvas, and musicians attending the gods' banquets. 678 Crook generalizes about these courtly fairy women, they are all of surpassing beauty, skilled in music and the dance, with white skins, and always dressed in red. 679 Their nobility and white skins makes Crook's definition of fairies seem implicitly and uncomfortably racialized. Crook next discusses the jinn, who he categorized as genii. 680 Why they are categorized as such is not explained, but throughout his description he does not refer to them as fairies. On the other hand, the companions of the hill boot called Iri are fairies, with backwards turning feet. 681 Crook likens their night rides to the European wild hunt and also draws parallels with horse-ridden fairies at night, citing antiquarian John Brand. 682 It is unclear why Aries' companions are defined as fairies yet the jinns are not. Crook seems to take his lead from the passage cited from Edwin Atkinson in the Himalayan Gazetteer. 683 Like many of his FLS colleagues, Crook does not clearly explain why some supernatural creatures are fairies, whilst others are merely like fairies. Crook applies the definition in a seemingly uncritical and arbitrary manner. Nevertheless, the European fairy shapes Crook's presentation and understanding of Indian supernatural beings. Nathani notes that colonial scholarship saw every movement as either to or from Britain, thus creating loops of cultural networks all linked to Britain, rather than comparing one colony to another. 684 Crook observes and makes sense of Indian beliefs through the filter of British and European folkloric theory and concepts. Despite being located in India from 1871, Crook was familiar with British folkloristics. Nathani notes that little attention has been paid to Crook, working with European anthropological theories in a non-European context. 685 Although he describes being far away from works of references and libraries, Crook clearly had access to key folklore volumes. 686 He applies familiar anthropological theories and cites other FLS members' works in relation to Indian folklore. The FLS aimed to create a collection of works which members, such as Crook, could access from the corners of the empire. Popular Religions bibliography includes 677 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, pp. 265-266. 678 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 265. 679 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 266. 680 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 265. 681 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 262. 682 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 262. 683 E. T. Atkinson, The Himalayan Gazetteer, Volume 2 pt. 2, New Delhi, 1884 pp. 825-826. 684 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 111. 685 Nathani, In Quest of Indian Folktales, p. 15. 686 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, b. 75. Clouston's Popular Tales, Fraser's Golden Bough, Heartland's Science of Fairy Tales and Legend of Perseus, Lang's Custom and Myth and Ritual and Religion, and 3 of Jacobs's Fairy Tales series. Crook also discusses FLS members' theories with familiarity. For example, he cites MacRitchie's theory in relation to iron being used to scare demons. 687 Crook also cites Riz's theory regarding legends of fairy gifts being related to ancestral benefactions, perhaps from a fairyland of untold wealth and blisses, as believed in by the Celts and other Aryan peoples. 688 Popular religions can easily be situated within the FLS corpus. Crook's work bridged the gap between armchair scholarship and fieldwork, albeit with much assistance from Chabet. Nevertheless, Nathani notes that contributions to the scientific exploration of Indian folklore by colonial collectors are negligible, as they recorded what they chanced upon, whilst pursuing their main imperial obligations. 689 This correlates with the low numbers of FLS members outside of Britain. After his lengthy Indian career, Crook's presidential speeches just before World War I highlight a change in folklore collection methodology and theoretical conceptions. In The Scientific Aspects of Folklore, 1912, he notes that recent developments in experimental psychology and the improved appliances now available for field work have done much to extend our knowledge of savage mentality. 690 He saw Dr. Meyer's work in the Torres Straits as confirming and underpinning the comparison of material from European peasants and savage tribes. 691 Crook's second presidential speech, Method of Investigation and Folklore Origins 1913, highlighted how folklore should be contextualized and not, heedlessly abstracted, from social context. 692 The New School, from America demonstrated the fall away from universalist comparative methodologies, which took decontextualized facts and compared them. Crook highlighted the importance of regional surveys to underpin strong comparative studies. 693 Crook reflects that the highest value evidence came from observers who had resided in an area for a long time, acquiring an intimate knowledge of local language, mental characteristics, and institution. 694 He considered older materials collected casually by the uninstructed traveler during a scamper over half a continent as considerably less reliable. 695 He warns writers, dependent upon published literature, to be cautious when using such casually collected material. 696 Crook, from his hands-on experience collecting abroad. 687 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 12. 688 Crook, Popular Religions, Volume 1, p. 287. 689 Nathani, Story Time of the British Empire, p. 88. 690 W. Crook, Presidential Address, The Scientific Aspects of Folklore, Folklore 23, 1912-23. 691 Crook, Presidential Address 1912, 23. 692 W. Crook, Presidential Address, Method of Investigation and Folklore Origins, Folklore 24, 1913, 18-19. 693 Crook, Presidential Address 1913, 21. 694 Crook, Presidential Address 1913, 21. 695 Crook, Presidential Address 1913, 21. 696 Crook, Presidential Address 1913, 23. Demonstrates an enhanced critical awareness of methodology. Burns and Crook's FLS presidencies reflect the enhanced importance of fieldworkers. As anthropological fieldwork became more professionalized, its status was enhanced in the FLS, but the focus also began to shift away from comparative folklore towards anthropology. Another important Indian collector and respected anthropologist was John Henry Hutton, who joined the Indian Civil Service in 1909 and contributed his early fieldwork collections to folklore. 697 In the Folk Tales of the Angami Nagas of Assam, 1914-1915, he records several native folk tales. 698 Hutton later published the Angami Nagas 1921, and the Seema Nagas 1921, and from 1937 held the William Wise Chair of Social Anthropology in Cambridge. 699 Hutton was also FLS president during World War II. 700 In his Assam folktale articles, Hutton carefully explains his collection methods, providing a detailed area description. Hutton acknowledges that the translations are not exactly made. 701 Due to variations in local dialects, the tales were collected in a lingua franca, bastard Assamese, used by government interpreters. 702 He notes that the stories were collected while on the march and around campfires, mainly from children who knew imperfect versions from old men or their mothers. 703 His translations are a free rendering of the recorded Assamese version, with no additions or insertions. 704 Hutton mentions two interpreters, one of unusual intelligence, and another with strong knowledge of Angamos history and customs. 705 The interpreters are not named. Hutton seemingly considered their services as intermediary assistance, similar to Crook's consideration of Shabe. His tales do not include fairies but feature some local supernatural beings such as the Ukepanopfu, the first human being, 706 the Terhuma spirit, 707 an ogress, 708 and an echoing wood spirit named Musa Musa who steals men. 709 Hutton is concerned with these beings' precise nature in their native cultural context. He does not apply the comparative folklore model in his article, a method which would have most likely led him to draw direct parallels with the British fairy. In this way, we can see fairies becoming less important to the work of early 20th century anthropologists. 697a. Fetch, J. H. Hutton, Pitt Rivers Museum. Last access the 22nd of February 2019. 698 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of the Angami Nagas of Assam I, Folklore 25 1914, 476-498, J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of the Angami Nagas of Assam, 2, Folklore 26 1915, 82-88. 699 Petch, J. H. Hutton, C. Von Führer Heimendorf, Obituary, J. H. Hutton, Proceedings of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland 1968, 66-67. 700 J. H. Hutton, Presidential Address, Folklore 52, 1941, 83-100. 701 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 478. 702 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 478. 703 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 478. 704 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 478. 705 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 478. 706 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 479. 707 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 486-487, 489-490. 708 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas I, 492-493. 709 J. H. Hutton, Folk Tales of Angami Nagas II, 85. 77.